What images does France conjure up for you? For me, it's beautiful houses and gardens, but also glorious markets, street cafes, and a deeply formative experience. When I was 19, I came to the south of France and lived in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months. And ever since then, I've loved France and everything to do with it. And I want to share that passion for the country with you through its gardens. I'll discover what their gardens reveal about French history, their love of food, the soil, and the arts, and why they value order and structure so highly. I'll be travelling the byways of the French countryside. This is what a deux chevaux was made for. Meeting local gardeners.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Monty. Bonjour, José.
Tasting the very best of their harvest.
Sometimes this job is really good.
Getting to turn on huge fountains.
I can hear the water.
I'm trying to find out what makes French gardens, and indeed the French, unique. Today, I'm going to show you formal French gardens and reveal how they were built upon passion, and power, and ambition, and disgrace. In these gardens, you can see the story of France itself as the great figures of French history use their gardens to express their power. They thought nothing of remodeling landscapes, moving villages, even diverting rivers. And I'll see how this formal style and the rebellion against it still resonates today in the culture and gardens of modern France. This story begins here, by the banks of the river Cher in the Loire Valley, and at one of France's most famous chateaux. The year is 1555, and the place is Chenonceau in all its Renaissance glory. France is under the rule of Henri II. The gardens here are amongst the first and most important in France, and there were two built in sequence. The first, the large rectangular one, was created by the king's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. She was older than him, much older, 20 years older, but he adored her. And he gave her the chateau of Chenonceau as a statement of his love. And once here, she made herself a garden. And when she made it, it was a major work. It was large, took 4 years to build, and she put it practically in the river, so it needed these vast walls to protect it from the water. Of course, when it was done and people saw it, they didn't just admire the garden, they admired her as a statement of her power in the land. The garden was a lavish status symbol. Henri had to raise a special tax to pay for its construction, and it was built to be both decorative and productive. We know, for example, there was a delivery of 300 apple trees, and fruit would have been a key part of it, and of course the walls would have had fruit growing all the way around. And there were lots of flowers. There were irises and lilies and roses, so it would have been a very productive place, vegetables in there too, but it would have been lovely, it would have smelled lovely. There would have been flowers in every season. So it would have been this little paradise, enclosed and protected, but there to be enjoyed in every season and weather. I do think that this great terrace that goes right round the garden tells us so much about how the garden was used and viewed, because it wasn't for access. This was for Diane and her friends and ladies-in-waiting to come and walk round. And you could see them with their wonderful dresses, slowly promenaded round, the chateau in the background, and significantly the garden below them. So they viewed it from above and looking inwards. Diane's garden at Chenonceau is a superb example of an enclosed, protected Renaissance garden. But 5 years after she had completed it, the king died. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, kicked Diane out and proclaimed her power by building a garden of her own on the far side of the drawbridge. In many ways, it's strikingly similar to Diane's, with the same inward, enclosed structure. Catherine used it for secret meetings and political maneuvering, safe in its enclosed world. But within 100 years, the rich and powerful of France will be creating gardens on an even more extraordinary scale, outdoing each other with ever more ambitious plans. Landscapes would be reshaped, huge canals dug, and rivers rechanneled to supply elaborate water displays. These gardens would set a style which has remained a hallmark of the French garden ever since. One man dominated this new style of gardening, and now I want to show you the first of his gardens.
Visiting gardens is really difficult without a car. So I'm on my way to meet a man who's got a car for me, and it's rather a good one.
I used to have a little 2CV years ago, and I'm looking forward to driving one again.
Jacques, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Ça va, voilà. Oui, ça va très bien. C'est belle. Oui. That's lovely. Il marche bien?
Très très bien, une merveille.
Oh Bon.
Le moteur, c'est une horloge.
OK.
Être prudent avec la boîte de vitesse, mais le moteur fonctionne très bien.
So, that lovely feeling. So let's put the key in the right way. It always helps. La première fois.
Ah oui, mais elle est comme neuve. Là, on est en première.
Bon,
Là, on est en deuxième.
ça y est.
Voilà.
C'est tout simple.
Merveilleux.
Merci beaucoup.
Bonne route.
Merci. A little bit tight. Oops. We're off.
The man who designed the garden I'm about to visit is the most important figure in French garden design. His name was André Lenotre. He was born 400 years ago and followed his father as royal gardener at the Tuileries in Paris. The first garden he was commissioned to make was at Vaux-le-Vicomte, 35 miles southeast of Paris.
André Lenotre spent 20 years as a royal gardener. He also painted and mixed with a group of sophisticated and creative people. So by the time he was called to Vaux-le-Vicomte, he was ready.
France in the mid-17th century was riven with rebellion and intrigue. The king, Louis XIV, had been on the throne since he was a boy, but had only just taken control of his kingdom. Lenotre and this brand new garden would be at the very center of a royal power struggle. This is the chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte. And this is the garden that provoked a king to rage.
At first glance, everything seems completely ordered and absolutely symmetrical, but in fact, it's not symmetrical. As you look, there are differences on either side, but what it is harmonious and balanced. And that was the ideal that Lenotre was aiming for and achieved miraculously here.
Vaux-le-Vicomte belonged to and was commissioned by Nicolas Fouquet. He'd risen fast to become France's finance minister and had made himself colossally wealthy in the process. And he wanted to show the world that he had arrived. He asked Lenotre to do something more impressive and radical than had ever been done before. result was a garden with a single great axis, which ran unbroken from the chateau's entrance to the far horizon.
Le Notre's big idea was to cut through the landscape on a scale that no one else had ever imagined before. And that created the impression of the garden reaching right out.
Le Notre broke the mold of Vaux by the scale and effortless ease in the way that the garden opens out to the visitor. Carefully judged changes in level meant that alleys, pools, cascades, and the canal that bisects the site gradually reveal themselves as you walk through. Mind you, Le Notre had Fouquet's limitless fortune and an army of 18,000 men to carve this out of the landscape.
But he also had another weapon in his armory, and that was military knowledge. By the middle of the 17th century, cannons had developed enormously, and in response to that, the French in particular developed the ability to create ramparts with very sophisticated earth-moving skills. And Le Notre took those skills and applied them to gardens.
Where once there were 190 acres of farmland, Le Notre and his army swept away a village and 2 hamlets and diverted a river to create Nicolas Fouquet's garden. But beneath the garden, there are also half a dozen water reservoirs, ingeniously engineered to feed the fountains, and it's all done by gravity.
Donc je vais vous ouvrir la trappe pour que vous puissiez descendre. Je vous montre.
The head gardener, Patrick Bourgeot, is showing me how it works.
Do you have to turn it up? Do you want a hand?
Well, that looks good.
Et on descend.
Yeah.
Descend.
Okay,
C'est
we'll go
parti.
down.
Allez-y, descendez, faites attention au dos.
Okay, here we go.
Attention à la dernière marche. Et donc voilà une des pompes du système hydraulique de Vaux-le-Vicomte.
So it's the same pump, is it, that has been used throughout? Same system.
Le système est exactement le même qu'au XVIIe siècle, mais il a été entièrement reconstruit à la fin du XIXe siècle.
And how much water is in
En totalité, il y a 1500 mètres cubes.
Ça va?
Oui. Oui. Alors, juste. Wait. Let's go. Si vous voulez, on peut la tourner maintenant.
I can hear the water. And all those millions of gallons of water collected for the entertainment of a few people. Fantastic.
The protected intimacy of the Renaissance garden is thrown open and replaced by vast vistas. Instead of a safe haven, this garden is about scale and ambition. Presided over by a giant brooding Hercules, Vaux-le-Vicomte wasn't just a series of outdoor rooms where one might relax, entertain, or even scheme. This was a garden whose scale made it seem like a provocative political act.
This is a very masculine garden, and above all, it's a statement of power and wealth. And that fact was to prove to be its undoing.
On August the 17th, 1661, Nicolas Fouquet threw a party in the garden to celebrate the completion of the work. 6,000 people were invited, including the 22-year-old King Louis. The guests were bedazzled. There were wonderful fireworks and fountains, and even a specially commissioned play and a ballet.
It was a triumph, except for one thing. The king was beside himself with fury at the arrogance of Fouquet, showing that he was richer and potentially more powerful than himself. And just a few weeks later, he had Fouquet arrested and had him sent to prison, where he remained for the rest of his days. Now, Louis didn't stop there. Not only had he got rid of the man, he then proceeded to take everything that everyone had admired so much. He took statues. He even dug up plants. And above all, he took the designers, amongst whom was Le Nôtre. And he said to them, I want this. I want it just as good, if not better. And I want it bigger. And I want it at Versailles.
At that time, Versailles was still a modest hunting lodge. But within a year, Le Nôtre and his colleagues from Vaux-le-Vicomte were busy turning it into a palace and garden fit for a king. The Hall of Mirrors is the best introduction to the splendor of Versailles.
Wow.
Light is caught and magnified in over 350 mirrors. And by the time it was finished in 1680, the palace had grown to over 700 rooms. From its windows, you can gaze down at the enormity of the grounds, with nearly 2,000 acres of gardens, stretching out to the far horizon.
The genius of Le Nôtre was to take what was already here and expand it and transform it. And there was already an avenue running east-west. So he widened it and put in this vast canal, and then with clipped hedges either side of it. So that the flat water, the clipped hedges were a perfect expression of domination over wildness. And that was a good thing. It wasn't considered to be suppression, but it was about order and harmony and peace. And to have those things, you had to have power. And to have them in a more dramatic way than anyone else in the world meant that Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the most powerful man in the world.
Just as he'd done at Vaux-le-Vicomte, Le Nôtre laid out a series of parterres, elaborate patterns in plants designed to be seen from above.
Originally, parterres got their colour from ground glass, broken pots, coloured gravel, but increasingly flowers. And as they poured in from all over the world, more and more were used. And tulips, for example, went from being incredibly precious to being more common. And in fact, there are stories of 150,000 plants coming in, plants being put in overnight, so Louis would wake up and see a new colour scheme, and nurseries made. There's one in the south of France, where exotics would come in and be trialled and grown on to see if they were hardy. And if they were good enough, they came up to Versailles.
While the tourists and I battle with our brollies in the wind and the rain, I'm on my way down to the orangerie to see the citrus trees being brought out of their winter quarters. Being Versailles, this was built as the biggest orangerie in Europe. There are over 1,100 trees here. Each one has to be brought out in spring and then put back into the orangerie in autumn to protect it from frost.
This style of container, of course, is known in England as a Versailles planter. And it is almost perfect for moving the citrus about. In Italy, of course, they're in terracotta pots always. But I bet some of them break. And these can be repaired endlessly, because they have the metal corners and then the oak sides get replaced as needed. Although I've been told that there are records in the 18th century of them collapsing, and just as they're moved, the whole thing falls apart, and that the secret are the metal corners.
Hop, je prends, hop, un citron. Et je mets ça dans les mains, comme ça, je fais ça.
Oh,
Et là, ça c'est bon.
yes.
Ça, c'est quand t'as le blues. Quand t'as le blues. Tu vois?
Oui.
Ça, c'est bon. Tu vois?
Ah,
Hein?
c'est
Ça
fantastique.
coûte pas cher et t'es heureux. Tu vois,
Joel Cotin is the head
c'est pas
gardener.
grand-chose, tu vois. Il y en a qui vont à l'autre bout de la terre. Moi, je vais pas à l'autre bout de la terre. Il y a tout ce qu'il faut ici.
We all know about Le Nôtre as a designer and a great historic figure, but as a gardener, what do you think he was like?
Alors, le terme designer pour le nôtre ne lui convient pas. Moi, le terme jardinier lui va très bien. Et surtout le terme, c'est un curieux de l'époque. Donc il s'est intéressé à tous les arts de l'époque. Et il a eu la chance de naître au Louvre. Son père était jardinier au Louvre. Donc c'est quelqu'un, un curieux qui s'est intéressé à tous les arts. Et donc, en plus, il a eu dans sa vie la chance de rencontrer un roi, et un roi qui lui a donné les moyens d'exprimer son talent.
Versailles took everything that had preceded it and exaggerated it. There's just more of Versailles than anywhere else, and it's still a byword for enormity in a garden. And what we see now is not so very different to the 17th century. It would have been full of people because the court had to be here. They had to be observed, and Louis kept his eye on them.
Le Nôtre employed several devices to create the sense of scale and surprise. Water was perhaps the most important, which he used in vast reflective pools of light and in a series of extraordinary fountains. Another was dramatic alley of tightly clipped trees.
There are few things in life finer than a good hedge. And the hedges here at Versailles are particularly good. And they're mostly hornbeams. And it lends itself to great big hedges because it will grow very tall, but at the same time can be clipped very narrow. And this one, for example, is pencil thin. So it creates room for another narrower passageway on the other side, which has a lot of dynamism and energy, and I find just completely thrilling.
On either side of the central axis, Le Nôtre laid out a series of bosquets, small woods contained by clipped hedges.
Voilà, donc je vais vous faire passer par le chemin des jardiniers,
Ouais.
qui va vous permettre d'accéder directement au bosquet.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Inside each of these bosquets is an entertainment or spectacle designed to be visited in turn as you make a grand tour of the garden.
This was Le Nôtre's last piece of work at Versailles. It's the first time I've seen it. And it's known as the Salle de Bal.
It was created as a dance theatre, and the cascade merely a backdrop to ballet performances laid on for the court. Le Nôtre was in his 70s when he created his final Baroque extravaganza.
It is fantastically impressive.
Although his work was so dramatic, Le Nôtre himself seems to have been a modest, self-effacing man.
Every account of him has a tone of not just respect, but genuine affability. People liked Le Nôtre. He was, by all accounts, a good and decent man. Just interested in his work, he never sought to aggrandize or glorify himself. And tellingly, he remained the king's friend right up to his death.
He died in 1700, leaving little in the way of plans. But gardens in his style would soon be made right across Europe, thanks to one book that I've come to see in the library at Versailles.
Now, this book is really important because it spread the word of Le Nôtre, and it was called La théorie et la pratique du jardinage. And it includes plans and descriptions on how to make parterre, de bosquet, boulingrin, which of course is a corruption of bowling greens, as well as labyrinths, rooms, galleries, cascades, all the elements of the fashionable garden. And the really important thing is it includes a lot of Le Notre's work and disseminated it. It spread it across Europe. And this French formal garden design was enormously influential. And through this book, someone could buy it and say, oh yeah, I like that. I want that. Here we are, a palisade à l'Italien, and then a palisade from Chantilly, and then a theatre from Versailles. The pictures are there, descriptions, and it was really like a textbook on how to make gardens.
The book was translated into English and German, and soon there were gardens in the new French style from Blenheim Palace to St. Petersburg. But perhaps the most significant of all Le Notre's achievements are the changes he made to the Tuileries Gardens in the heart of Paris. This has been a public garden for hundreds of years. It's a place for Parisians to meet, promenade, and watch the world go by. It was Le Notre who laid it out in its modern form, with its carefully spaced trees and wide pathways.
As so often happens, it was the combination of technology and genius that came together, because the graphometer, which is one of these, was invented about 10 years before Le Notre's birth. So by the time he began to use it in his 20s, it was established. And it's a very simple instrument, but it did enable him to have much grander designs than had hitherto been possible. And it works on the basis you have a fixed baseline, and you take a reading, and you look down through there, and there's a hair lined up on that. And so I can fix that like that, and it's on a post. And then you keep that fixed and move round it, and then adjust this off that baseline, look through, take a reading, and the angle between the two can be written down. So you can put that onto a plan, which means that when you give it to your workmen, they can get it exactly right, even if it's a mile away and it's a great long canal or it's a massive avenue. And of course, that with his vision changed everything.
With his graphometer in hand and an army of labourers, Le Notre was able to cut a central axis running west through the garden and out on beyond its boundaries into what was then open countryside. Originally, this new magnificent vista was named the Avenue des Tuileries. Now, of course, it's called the Champs-Élysées and remains the spine of modern Paris.
Well, the only reasonable response to that view is utter amazement. It is stunning. I actually last saw it 42 years ago, and I couldn't really remember it. And I certainly didn't know then that this, of course, is the line that Le Notre planted. And of course, now we have the Arc de Triomphe, and beyond, from his planting in the 17th century, on cutting through the city into the 21st. In the 1980s, Mitterrand, the president, had this great arch in La Défense commission. So now Le Notre's line runs through Paris, stretching from the Tuileries to the Arc de Triomphe to that arch, running for over 5 miles.
The arch is the centerpiece of France's financial district, known as La Défense. 10% of the country's wealth is concentrated up in these skyscrapers. From their vantage point, France's financial moguls can see straight back into the heart of historic Paris.
That is an extraordinary view. And I suppose you could see it as a sort of brutal motorway just bulldozing through the center of this lovely city. Or you could see it completely in the spirit of Le Notre, this control of nature that somehow humanizes it at the same time. And in that spirit, down here at La Défense, is a garden.
La Défense was begun in the 1950s as a defiant symbol of France's post-war recovery. And there was only ever one choice of garden style to express the power and wealth the city fathers of Paris hoped would be created here.
The garden was put out to competition, which was won by an American called Dan Kiley. Now, Dan Kiley came to Europe in the Second World War as a serving American soldier, and whilst he was here, he visited the great gardens. And he was enormously influenced by Vaux-le-Vicomte and Versailles. And there's an irony that it took an American to bring back the spirit of Le Nôtre to Paris.
The choice of planting reflects how the world has changed since Le Nôtre's day.
It's easy to think of these beautifully pruned plane trees as quintessentially French and particularly Parisian, but in fact they're very practical. The reason they were planted and continue to be planted is because they resisted pollution. And an awful lot of Le Nôtre's trees died out in the 19th century because of the increased using of coal, which then polluted them. The trees just couldn't cope with this smog that fell on them. Because plane trees lose their bark. So that a year's accumulation of black soot was just shed, and they started over again. So actually, it's a completely practical thing.
I wonder what Le Nôtre would have made of this concrete and glass city. The buildings jostling and competing for space, with none of the symmetry or balance of Versailles or Vaux-le-Vicomte. But his legacy can be found in odd corners.
As you wander around, you'll discover that off the main drag are these side gardens like this one. The cherry today is absolutely at its best. And it's not too fanciful to feel that Kiley has deliberately taken the idea of the bosque and instead of having trees and square woods, has got these square concrete blocks of flats and then little sort of jewel-like gardens inside them.
Dan Kiley took the style of Le Nôtre and expressed it in modern language. But everywhere you look in Paris, you can see the visual vocabulary of Le Nôtre's great gardens, still closely associated with power, wealth, and the state. So outside Les Invalides, France's military museum and Napoleon's tomb, rows of topiary stand like soldiers waiting to go into battle. In public squares like the Place des Vosges, the plane trees are lined up in strict geometric lines. Order, harmony, and symmetry are everywhere, and not just in gardens.
Bonjour.
Je peux vous aider peut-être?
See, what you have here is the extraordinary elegance of French formality. It's something that the British can't really do, and if we do it, we copy the French. But that symmetry and order, coupled with a refinement, is seen everywhere, and this sort of epitomizes it. Slightly frivolous, but in the best possible way. Choices, choices.
Le choix est dur.
C'est très, très dur. Un tas de citron, s'il vous plaît.
Ce sera tout?
Oui, c'est tout pour le moment.
Sur place ou à emporter?
Sur place.
D'accord.
Bon, merci.
This elegant formality is as relevant today as it was in the 16th century. But there is another style of garden that came about as a result of the greatest crisis in French history. At the end of the 18th century, the Revolution disposed of royalty and aristocratic power. With this came new fashions, not least in gardens. The formal style of Le Nôtre became associated with the tyranny of the hated aristocracy and was replaced by a new, liberated informality. This is Malmaison, the home of Napoleon and Josephine on the western outskirts of Paris. There was once a large estate surrounding the house. All that remains today is a beautifully restored wildflower meadow and some woods.
It's said that Napoleon and Josephine planted this cedar of Lebanon to commemorate Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Marengo on the 14th of June, 1800. And that was the beginning of the garden here at Malmaison. Now, Josephine was a real gardener, and she was a very serious botanist. But her real passion, which amounted almost to an obsession, were roses.
And Josephine's passion for roses was as influential in its own way as the parterres of Le Nôtre.
Josephine set out to collect every type of rose growing in the world. Now, that was reckoned to be about 250 at that time. And Napoleon apparently instructed his generals to bring back plants wherever they were fighting in the world. So all the forces of the French Empire went behind this quest. Now, we don't know how successful it was, because when she died in 1814, there was no inventory of roses left behind. But what we do have is a fantastic pictorial record of at least some of her roses, because Josephine did commission a Belgian, Pierre-Joseph Redoute, to make engravings of her roses. And they are amongst the loveliest botanical images ever produced. And I've got one here of the rose grown at Malmaison, here looking at it at Malmaison, and that in itself is a thrilling thing. And it is Rosa indica, Rosier de Bengale, and Centefeuille. Now, Centefeuille is 100 leaves or centifolia. Now, names have changed since Josephine's time, but this is probably a centifolia rose which would have grown out there in the garden.
There are few roses left at Malmaison, but here at Roseraie de Lay, some 20 miles away, there is a magnificent collection, brought together by a rose enthusiast at the end of the 19th century. Jules Gravreau set out to create a collection to surpass even Josephine's, including the roses illustrated by Redoute.
And here it is, in the flesh, nearly 200 years later, Redoute's rose. It's called Rose de Bengale, from Malmaison, and preserved as such. And to make that link, to know that this was what Josephine collected, this is what Redoute drew. And here it is, in my hand, I'm holding it, I can smell it. It is heavenly. It's a lovely rose. I've never grown it myself. But that link is such powerful history.
You might think of roses as being part of a typically English garden, but Josephine was the first person in Europe to systematically collect them. And in the 19th century, the French were the world's leading rose breeders, and the names of many of our best-loved roses, such as Cardinal de Richelieu, Madame Alfred Carrière, Souvenir de Malmaison, or Chapeau de Napoleon, are French. I'm on my way to the Chateau of Courson, 20 miles south of the Roseraie. It hosts France's biggest flower show, and I want to see if Josephine's floral legacy has the same potency in the 21st century. Among the 250 stalls, a dozen of them are rose growers, like Denis Saint-Roch.
Bonjour. J'ai une question curieuse. Bonjour. Quelle place a la rose dans le cours de jardinier français?
La rose, c'est un des premiers végétales qu'on trouve dans tous les jardins français.
Oui.
C'est ce qu'il y a de plus important. On trouve aussi bien à Marseille, à Lille, à Brest ou à Strasbourg. C'est la première chose que les Français mettent dans leur jardin, c'est la rose.
Et quelle espèce de rose?
D'abord, ce que veut le Français, c'est de la grosse fleur à parfum.
Ouais.
Nous, on est créateurs de rosiers.
Ouais.
Aussi, on sort des nouvelles variétés. Et les gens sont attachés à la nouvelle variété, mais sont aussi attachés et apprécient les variétés anciennes.
Bon, merci. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Despite the rain, I'm having a good time. There's an easy informality, which has echoes of Malmaison.
This is good. See, they've got rhubarb for sale, direct from the producer, spread out on a leaf on the ground, but it's a plant stall selling rayums. Of course, rhubarb is a rayum, and it's a cousin of the rayum palmatum that you grow by your pond, which is entirely decorative. And what I particularly like is the way that this stall feels artless. This looks like it's just arrived, unloaded the van, put it out, and there it is. And that does give it a kind of authenticity and real charm that this whole show has. There's something truly charming about it.
The more informal style of gardening was called by the French le jardin à l'anglaise, and certainly most of these plants here at Courson will be at home in an English country garden. But I wonder if this is also true in Paris. This is the Quai de la Mégisserie, where Parisians have been buying their plants and seeds for hundreds of years. I've come here to meet Didier Brou, to find out what the people of Paris are growing today.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Parlez-vous anglais?
Just a little.
Just a little.
Yes.
I understand that you've been working here for 3 generations.
Yes, from here in this shop, from my grandfather. We arrived in 1929 from the Massif Central to sell some plants and beans and seeds for people of Paris.
And do Parisians like flowers? Do they enjoy flowers and buy a lot?
They buy flowers in Paris for French people. They prefer to buy plants like this with flower. And we have 2 sorts of people to buy in our shop. First, it's the gardener for vegetables. So they buy tomatoes, they buy cucurbitacea, salad, all things in plant and seeds. And after you have people who live in apartment in Paris and they want to make a small flower in big box, that's all. And they buy geranium, all.
You have lots of colour. They are all in flower, aren't they?
Yes.
They're not buying plants that will grow. They're buying plants that are good now.
So the modern French gardener does love flowers, but without the bother of growing them. Space in Paris is at a premium. It's got more than twice the population density of London, so gardens are rare. However, I've heard that one of their most upmarket fashion houses has managed to fit one in to an unlikely place. Hermès is a family firm, and the roof garden was created for their private use.
Who would have thought this would be on a roof? It's very smart. White tulips, white pansies. I bet these are white iceberg roses. Looking astonishingly healthy. It's funny to see a hawthorn pruned like that. That's really interesting. A hawthorn, which I think of in my garden as just a scrubby part of a hedge, treated as a decorative shrub, lovingly pruned. It's nice.
This garden strikes me as a modern version of Le Jardin à l'Anglaise. It's understated, controlled elegance.
Of course, what this is international good taste. It's stylish, it's chic, it actually smells a bit of money. So I guess it's very Parisian. It's probably St. Petersburg, New York, Boston, who knows, even Shanghai now. I bet there's a roof garden in Shanghai that looks quite like this. Probably a Hermes roof garden in Shanghai. And there does seem to be a language of the wealthy that is to do with leather and white and box balls. And one part of me feels extremely cynical about it. And the other part of me, rather shamefully, just likes it. Of course, the other thing, which I bet happens here, is that terribly competitive business, fashion business, and everybody's always looking at each other, and they'll be looking over at this roof garden and judging it. Oh, looking a bit shabby, or, oh, it's a bit good. Because actually, if you look over there, there's another roof garden for a company who shall be nameless that clearly could do with a little bit of tending to.
I love Paris. Why do I love Paris? Because my love is near.
Given the time, money and manpower involved, I thought it might be impossible to find a modern example of the kind of lavish formality we associate with Le Notre's gardens.
However, there is a garden here in Normandy that has been made in the last 20 years that I think Fouquet and the Sun King himself would have been envious of, even if it's only for its scale and its ambition, and to be honest, for its brashness too.
Just 20 years ago, the garden at Champ de Bataille was an empty field. Many million euros later, it's been turned into a garden that Le Notre would be proud of. Parterre, central access, fountains, all the hallmarks of the formal 17th century garden are here. And it is all the creation of Jacques Garcia. Garcia first fell in love with this place as a child, when he would bicycle past it on his way to school. And decades later, when he had made a fortune as an international interior designer, he then got the chance to buy it. The sheer effort, time and cost of creating a garden like this with all modern-day equipment does make the gardens of 300 years ago all the more impressive.
Niveau ici,
Oui,
vous avez le fait ou...
C'est fait. Tout, le terrain, c'était comme ça. En fait, tous les niveaux ont été recréés. On a bougé ici pour créer l'espace 4 millions de mètres cubes de terre. Et 4 millions de mètres cubes, c'est un mur qui irait du nord de l'Angleterre au sud de l'Angleterre d'1 mètre par 4 mètres. Voilà, pour créer les espaces qu'on voit ici. Alors voilà le reflet. Ouais. Ouais. Tout ça a été créé, il n'y avait pas le canal.
Nothing there before at all.
Ah ben c'est le plus grand chantier en Europe, je crois, depuis le début du XXe siècle.
Oui.
Ouais, je crois.
C'est un projet si grand.
Oui, ça, c'est sûr.
Oui. Et peut-être il coûtera des millions.
Alors, c'est un sujet très intéressant parce que, déjà pour démarrer, je n'avais pas la conscience de la masse d'argent qu'il fallait. Et si j'avais su, c'est toujours la même histoire, je n'y serais jamais allé. Jamais. C'est quelque chose qui apporte une douleur qu'on ne peut même pas raconter. Car quand vous démarrez ça, tout le monde est contre vous. Après, évidemment, aujourd'hui, vous me dites que c'est très beau. Très bien. Vous seriez venu en 94, vous rentriez en Angleterre en disant « ce type est un dingue, il faut l'arrêter ».
But it has evidently been worth it. And Jacques is adamant that it is more than just a pastiche of Le Notre.
Rien n'est une reconstitution pure et dure ici. Tous ces ifs que vous voyez là, jamais ça a été fait au XVIIe siècle. Mais si quelqu'un y avait pensé au XVIIe siècle, il s'inscrivait dans l'idée du XVIIe siècle. Ce qui compte, c'est de ressortir l'âme de la chose et pas nécessairement une justesse d'un moment précis qui d'ailleurs n'avait qu'un caractère très éphémère.
A garden like this is so outside normal domestic experience that it's hard to take in. And, you can see what happened to Nicolas Fouquet when he tried. He came to a bad end. And Louis XIV could rule the world. And so the garden became an expression of that. And for Monsieur Garcia, it is an incredible thing to attempt to do. And he did say if he'd known, he never would have tried it. And the millions it's cost him and the years it's taken. But how fabulous that it's done. The Baroque garden was a place that was shiny, it was gold-plated, it was splashy and noisy and absolutely about money. So if you come here, which you should do because it's lovely, what you're getting is what the 17th century garden actually would have been like. When you walk here, you're walking in exactly the same spirit of a garden that Versailles was, or Vaux-le-Vicomte. It's got under the skin of the 17th century in a way that no historical recreation, however accurate, ever could do.
Perhaps Garcia's creation confirms that in the end, France's greatest contribution to landscape gardens is in the formality and scale set by Le Nôtre. This style of gardening, with its balance, order and love of structure, is still at the heart of French life. In the modernist alleys of La Défense, the rows of plane trees in the public gardens of Paris, and even in the layout of Paris itself. Added to this, Josephine's love of roses and informality can still be found. I've kept my favourite garden, the Château of Corrence, to last, because it has the best qualities of both styles.
I want to show you now a garden that's about 35 miles south of Paris. And I love it because it seems to me the perfect combination of the rigour and formality of the 17th century formal garden, and also the charm that comes when a garden is allowed to mature and slowly age across the centuries.
Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte have been preserved as they were in the 17th century. But Corrence shows what happens when you allow this formal style to change and evolve. First created during the Renaissance, the gardens were remodeled in the style of Le Nôtre, but fell into disuse. When the de Gannet family bought the abandoned chateau in the 1870s, they restored the gardens and have continued to adapt them since. From its beginning, the layout of Corrence has been hugely influenced by its ready supply of that one key ingredient of the French formal garden: water.
In the 17th century, the single most impressive thing to have in a garden was water. And people went to extraordinary lengths, both financially and with ingenuity, not to say skill, to provide it, to control it, shape it, divert it, and to impress people. Now, Corrence has masses of water. And that's because it's a wet place. There are springs popping up all over the place. And the net result is that there is a kind of effortless ease with which it's carried.
Perhaps the garden's greatest involuntary transformation came in the last war, when the chateau was requisitioned by first the Germans and then the Allies, and much of the garden was buried under concrete. I'm having tea with Philippine de Gannet, who's lived here for over 60 years.
Phil Marshall Montgomery was here, very strict. He was only nice with, only charming with the children, my daughters who were tiny, 7, 8, and 10. And with us he was very nice, but not very amusing.
So what was the garden like just after the war?
It was a shamble. Because as you know, a garden, if you haven't taken care of it for 4 years, and my husband, when he came back from Indochina, he said, I'm going to try and save it. And then he changed the park a lot because all the paths used to be in gravel, you know, there were people scratch all day, or in yellow sand. And now there's none left apart this one across. All the rest you've been walking on is grass. Yes. I must say, I think it's very beautiful. And for a very formous, pompous garden, generally they're formal and pompous, but they don't have much charm. And I find this has charm, and people say to me, oh, c'est charmant. Well, it's funny to say that about something like this, but you see, so I hope they'll continue liking it as we did.
By replacing the hard lines and gravel paths of the historic garden with lawn, Philippine and her husband have made Couronces into a garden which is both formal and romantic.
It's interesting how, at this time of year in particular, mid-spring, the emerging leaves don't cast shade as such. They just change the texture of the green. So you have all these different green lights, from the very pale to the really quite rich and dark, but not somber. And that's lovely. And also, because you know that it's temporary, it feels precious. So the whole thing glows.
One of the things I love about Couronces is the way it takes the classic forms of the French formal garden and lets them grow wild to transform them.
The bosquet at Versailles are tightly enclosed little woods with the trees peeking out of the top of tall hedges. But here, the woods have exploded out. They're mature. They've got hundreds of years' worth of growth. And the hedges are garden-sized. And so the relationship has completely changed between the inside and the outside. And if anything, I think this looks better. The key to this garden is that it is as historical in terms of provenance and story as any in France, really, but that it has evolved. It's evolved in the way that people use it, and also in the way that plants have been allowed to grow. They've changed and adapted. But the spirit of the garden, and that means the framework too, has remained. And it's that balance that has been nurtured and maintained between the past and the living present that makes it so successful.
Next time, I get my hands dirty and explore a very different side to French life.
On coupe, et on lève. That's it. On rebouche.
Asperge blanche.
Their passion for food and their fantastic kitchen gardens, from the monastic tradition through the great historical potager to the gardens of Michelin-starred restaurants.
Stay here on BBC HD. The teams on QI are gathering for another fab swipe at the English language. And tonight it's J for jargon. That's next.
What images does France conjure up for you? Now, for me, there are beautiful houses and gardens of all kinds, but also glorious markets, street cafes, and some very formative experiences.
When I was 19, I came to the south of France and lived in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months. And ever since then, I've loved France and everything to do with it. And I want to share that passion for the country with you through its gardens.
I'll discover what their gardens reveal about French history, their love of food, the soil, and the arts, and why they value order and structure so highly. I'll be travelling the byways of the French countryside.
This is what a deux chevaux was made for.
Meeting local gardeners.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Monty. Bonjour, José.
Tasting the very best of their harvest.
Sometimes this job is really good.
Getting to turn on huge fountains.
I can hear the water.
And trying to find out what makes makes French gardens, and indeed the French, unique. Today, I'm looking into how the famous French love of food translates into their kitchen gardens. It's a busy weekday market in Aix-en-Provence. Beneath the shade of the plane trees, the stalls are rich with delicious-looking fruit and vegetables.
Oh, I love a cherry. Bonjour. Des cerises, c'est combien?
4,80.
Hein? Une demi-kilo.
This is not just for tourists.
Merci.
Unlike the UK, where we buy more of our food from supermarkets, about a third of French people still buy their fruit and veg from markets like these, where the display is all part of the shopping experience.
So look at that. That's just beautiful. Well, wouldn't you just want to have that at home?
Merci.
40 years ago, when I first came here, it was completely transforming. I'd grown up in a Britain where the food was remorselessly dreary and regarded as a bodily function rather than one of life's great pleasures.
So to come here and be exposed to the market and all these incredible vegetables and taste and the smell of it all, and to eat food that I'd only heard about, and then to connect that with the vegetables that I was already growing at home and realize that perhaps I could grow these too. And the connection between what I was doing with my hands in the soil and what I was eating was life-changing.
Now, all these years later, I want to see how these fabulous fruit and vegetables are grown.
On coupe, et on lève. That's it. On rebouche. Asperge blanche.
The story of the French kitchen garden begins in medieval monasteries and unfolds via the decorative vegetable gardens of the Grand Chateau to modern-day rural smallholdings. 1 in 2 French people regularly buy local produce because the attachment to a particular region and its soil still has real meaning. I'm getting around in a little 2CV. Now, of course, it's fun to drive, but in fact, a 2CV is exactly the right car for the job.
They were developed before the last war as an agricultural vehicle, and they were designed to take a farmer and his family with a load of eggs to market across rutted, ploughed ground without damaging the produce. That was the important thing. They had to be reliable and tough. And so it seems to me it's the ideal car to drive around France looking for that connection between growing and gardens, food and the land.
My first port of call is in the rugged landscape of the Cevennes. It's a remote and largely impoverished area, and many years ago I made a long walk right across it. But today I'm here to visit a nunnery, the Monastère de Sonon, which is a first for me.
The reason I wanted to come to a monastery was because the root of vegetable growing started in the monastic tradition, where nuns and monks would grow vegetables and herbs for the kitchen and also for medicine. And also the process of doing it was a kind of prayer, it was devotion. So that tradition actually has continued through to the present day, but it starts, or started, in the monasteries. Very difficult to contact them because they don't speak, so I can only ring them once a week, so I hope to God they're there. I must remember not to blaspheme, mustn't say hope to God or stuff like that. Can I hear footsteps? Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je suis Monty.
Pardon?
Monty, je m'appelle Monty.
Bonjour.
Bon, bonjour.
Merci.
Today is one of the rare days when they break their silence to receive visitors. There's been a monastery on this site since 1300, and the Mother Superior, who spoke perfect English, showed me around.
Our vegetable garden is very, how can we say that, modest. And we can't really say that it is exemplary on the aesthetic point of view. Excuse me, I'll just grasp the hat as well.
So how many of you work in this vegetable garden?
There are 16 nuns living here, and as well as a rigorous regime of prayer, they run a winery. And they still manage to be almost entirely self-sufficient.
So you say it's modest. It's a big area. I mean, it's a big vegetable garden.
It is, it is.
It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, but we are a lot of people eating here. That's why.
Well, a lot of people eating is one thing. You have to have a lot of people working.
As well.
Yes.
Yes, that's true.
So these are courgettes, are they, or squashes, or pumpkins?
Yes, pumpkins and courgette. We have two kinds.
yeah.
Or everything is sort of like mixed up.
You've got a lot.
Yes,
So
we
what's
do. We
the
have about 1 ton production
1 ton
of pumpkins per year.
What do you do with them?
We eat them during the whole winter.
Okay, sorry.
Ask a silly question.
I love all vegetables, so I'm not bored. I'll look at anything. It
You look at
fascinates me.
anything?
Yeah, no.
So here we have our cucumbers.
Right, so cucumbers, you see, growing so lushly and so well outside.
Ah.
We struggle to grow cucumbers outside. Would it be very rude if I cut one and tasted it?
Oh, not at all.
Whoops, I'm dropping my phone. I have my glasses, so everything always drops out my pocket. I do it at home the whole time. So, looks nice. Oh, smell that. It's just
yes, refreshing.
all cucumber refreshing. So this, it's good. It's not quite ripe, but it's good. Do you want some?
Yes, I would. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Not quite ready. It's a little bit bitter.
Mm.
I'm afraid I've wasted it because it should have been left for a little bit longer.
Don't worry.
I suspect that this monastic scene has changed little since its medieval inception and has the same workmanlike mixture of fruit, vegetables and medicinal herbs that set the model for all subsequent French kitchen gardens.
This is for real. They do not grow vegetables because they like the experience or because it peps up their diet. They grow vegetables because that is what they eat. And if they don't grow, they don't eat. And their choice of vegetables is influenced by that. So an awful lot of things that will store well, a lot of things that grow well here, they can't afford to play at it in any sense of the word. So there is an edge to this, a kind of really deep survival seriousness, which yet they seem to go through with extraordinary grace. But these are very hard-working, efficient, busy people.
A bell marks the start of the brief 20 minutes break allocated for dinner, and I join the nuns to share their homegrown meal. The food is simple but good, although alas, it's not a saint's day, so no wine. And everyone tucks in with gusto, accompanied by a devotional reading. The highly practical medieval monastic gardens led to the development of the potager, the French style of kitchen gardening, where looks matter as much as the quality or quantity of food that's grown. And I'm visiting a beautiful example in the Luberon, a couple of hours east of the Cevennes. After the unmanicured harshness of the Cevennes, the Luberon seems more affluent, although the sun is still scorching, and my little car isn't made for long, hot journeys.
Classic 2CV experience, caught between two gears.
I've come to the vineyard of Val-Joannis, near Pertuis, to visit its ornate potager, where flowers elegantly combine with fruit and vegetables.
That is a healthy, happy hollyhock. It just shows you what they like. Lots and lots of sunshine.
The word potager comes from the French potage, meaning soup, and originally referred to the patch where the ingredients were grown for the bowl of soup that was the mainstay of most people's midday meal. But this has evolved to become something much more elaborate and as meticulously controlled as the vines that grow all around the garden here at Val-Joannis.
All the skills and discipline of growing and training vines can be seen in this garden. You have oak trees trained and growing as very tight, strict triangles. In fact, there's some oak trees over there which are just thin little columns with finials on top and joining in lattice work. And the whole thing, the whole garden, is a display and expression of the skills of man in controlling plants. And that really is the root of the French potager. It's controlling food production. So not only it looks good, but it does what it's told.
So this garden takes the idea of a monastic garden and then turns it on its head. Rather than existing to grow enough food to see you through winter, it is an ostentatious demonstration of wealth, power, and taste. This style of gardening began in the north of France, but before I head up that way, I want to try and get to grips with the French love of soil.
Okay, let's have a look.
My guide is Arnaud Marie, Val-Joannis' winemaker, or vigneron.
C'est tout à vous?
Oui. Yeah.
Very dry.
This year is very dry.
The key to this respect for the soil is the word terroir, which is an almost mystical combination of soil and place, and gives every wine its distinct local character.
Now the soil here, it's very dry, bone dry.
Très sec. C'est un mélange principalement d'argile.
D'argile, clay.
Clay, de calcaire.
Right, calcaire, lime.
Lime. Et après, il y a un petit peu de pierre, mais ici, pas trop.
And how important is it for le terroir et le choix des vins avec le sol?
Oui. Qu'est-ce qui est important?
Ça, c'est important?
C'est primordial. Ouais,
oui, c'est
une obligation.
Oui.
Quand on veut planter une vigne sur un terrain, on est obligé de connaître le sol,
oui.
Le climat et le sol.
You must know the soil, you must know the climate.
Yeah.
And is that something you have to grow up with? Or can you learn it from a book?
No.
No.
On peut pas là, ça c'est feeling.
The feeling, yeah.
So how does this alchemy of soil, sun and the vine distill itself into a glass?
Gosh. You see, here we are in Provence. Beautiful day, a fine wine.
Cheers.
Cheers, yes, we say.
Terroir is an elusive concept, but it is at the heart of the French relationship to their food, and I'll be seeing how it applies to growing vegetables and other fruit later.
Your soil is so stony.
Yes, we have a lot of stone.
You have a massive
Yes, yeah. But that's very good.
But now it's time to leave the sunshine for a while, head north and visit the most famous potager in the world. This is the Chateau of Villandry in the Loire Valley, 500 miles away from Provence and another climate entirely. This garden, which looks very old, was in fact only created just over 100 years ago, based on a notion of what the kitchen garden might have been like when the chateau was in its Renaissance heyday in the 16th century. On my way to find the head gardener, I get distracted and bedazzled by the sheer number of celery seedlings.
7, 38, 39, 40. So there are 40 times 4 trays. That's 160 trays, and each tray takes 20. So that's 3,200 plants. How about that?
I find Laurent in the lovely 18th century greenhouse shaped like an upturned boat, potting up peppers.
So how many plants do you raise here for the potager?
Alors pour le potager dans nos serres, nous produisons à peu près 70 000 plants.
70,000.
Et puis nous achetons également à peu près le même nombre de plants ou de fleurs.
Of the 140,000 plants, how much is eaten? How much is grown to be eaten?
Alors nous avons un potager décoratif qui n'est pas basé sur l'alimentaire. Donc nous présentons des légumes pour faire un paysage, de la mosaïculture. Donc nous ne pouvons pas cueillir les légumes pour faire des trous dans les massifs, mais par contre nous récoltons, nous pouvons cueillir les poivrons, les aubergines pour donner aux visiteurs et également donner aux gens qui travaillent pour le château.
The produce from this potager is not destined for potage or any other kind of meal. Everything here is for show. In fact, Laurent told me that the vast majority of the vegetables end up on the compost heap, including no less than 30,000 lettuces every year. It's been suggested that in the 16th century it was intended as a display of the exotic plants newly arrived from the Americas, a kind of edible cabinet of curiosities to be proudly displayed to visitors, which is exactly what it is today.
Of course, Villandry has always been popular and very well known, but it became especially popular in Britain in the 1980s, I think, because up until then, the model for all aspiring vegetable growers and social climbers was the Victorian walled garden. And inside that walled garden, you had your vegetables in long rows. And then in the 1980s, Rosemary Veary made the potager really popular, and that word entered into gardening fashionable talk. How's your potager, they would say in Hackney and Islington. And the difference was that you chose your vegetables and you laid them out for decorative purposes. You still ate them and you still wanted to grow them well, but decoration and little box hedges became part of the scene. And of course, the model of all that, the big daddy of all potagers, was here, at Villandry.
The potager is only part of a much bigger and wonderful garden at Villandry, but its ornamental rigour sets the tone for the whole place.
This is the herb garden, and even plants like horseradish has had its leaves trimmed off so they're all uniform size and length. And lovage, which in my garden is a great explosion of a plant, reaching 6 foot tall and bursting out all over the place, is marshalled into a sort of tight, orderly battalion. Now, there's no question, to my mind, that Villandry is one of the great gardens of the world. And if you're in France and you have any interest in gardens, come here. But I find the potager disappointing. It leaves me unsettled. And I think that's because function and form have grown too far apart. Where vegetables are not grown to eat at all, something really essential is lost. There's no sense of becoming, of growing, of evolving, and then, of course, the pleasure and excitement of harvest. And if it's all just grown to be a static picture, it's just not enough. And of course, you realize it needn't be vegetables. It could be colored glass or waxworks and have exactly the same effect.
Nevertheless, with its box hedge beds containing uniform ranks of ornamental vegetables, there are 1,000 gardens around the world, including my own, that owe a direct debt to Villandry.
That's it. They're cresting the wave. Will they get to the top? They're just about to do it. Yes! Oh, gold. Broken. There we are. There are 15 cars behind.
I'm on my way to a potager near Paris that grows and sells a huge amount of produce, and I think should be much better known. Every year, hundreds of thousands of tourists flock to Versailles, home of France's most flamboyant ruler, Louis XIV. He commissioned the magnificent gardens here, which we saw last week. But hardly any of these visitors go just round the corner from the palace to another of Louis's creations, which in its own way is just as extravagant.
This is the Potager du Roi at Versailles, made for the Sun King, Louis XIV, in the 17th century, and they've been growing fruit and vegetables here ever since.
The place is just huge, covering over 23 acres of walled garden, created to supply the king the fruit and vegetables that he adored. I met up with Antoine Jacobson, who is the current head gardener.
Fruit and vegetables. How many people do you have working?
There are 10 permanent gardeners.
Right. So not that many?
No, not enough.
No, said he with feeling.
The Potager du Roi is a superb demonstration of one of France's great contributions to horticulture, elaborate pruning, which is based upon the principle of restricting growth whilst keeping as much fruit as possible and making it look as good as possible.
Most of the tree shapes that we have in this garden are 19th century, though there's one just over there that is late 18th century.
Which one? Show me.
Right here.
Oh, this one?
Yes, this one here.
Which you never see in Britain.
In this case, for this shape, the idea is to have as much light getting to the interior as possible, so that we have fruit along all the branches. If we want this branch to have some light, we have to maybe take this one off and leave this one, so that the top ones can continue to be vigorous.
So every branch, every stem needs consideration.
Each tree gets individual attention.
Yeah.
And each tree has to be understood. I consider it often...
Until the end of the 18th century, all pruning was limited by what could be achieved with a single-bladed curved pruning knife, a serpette. But then the secateurs were invented, by a Frenchman, of course.
And it was the curved blade and the fact that you could use just one hand meant you could put your hand in, holding a pair of secateurs, and make a very precise cut on quite floppy material. And that had the effect of refining pruning and changing the shapes that were produced. So by the mid-19th century, people were pruning their fruit into much more ornate and sometimes really fantastical shapes, all because they could.
This potager works for me in a way that Villandry doesn't. And this is precisely because it is a working garden. Form and function meet. And nowadays, when the fruit is harvested, it's sold at the garden gates to passers-by. That's what a revolution can do for you. The decorative potager is France's most famous kitchen garden tradition, but the urge to grow one's food is deep in the French psyche.
Ah non. Oui, mais c'est moi qui le crois. Ah non, 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 ça va.
These are the Jardins Ouvriers, or workers' gardens, in one of the poorest districts of Paris. Over 40% of those out of work or retired grow some produce for their table. As in Britain, the allotment movement followed the drift of workers coming from the country into the cities, bringing with them their skills and experience of growing food. Eliane Davio has had her plot longer than most, and I'm paying her a visit.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Ah, ben j'ai du monde. Attention de ne pas tomber. Mets bien la rampe, hein, parce que sinon
Je
ça
m'appelle
glisse.
Monty.
Ça glisse. Hein.
Okay, well, I won't slip, don't worry.
Bonjour monsieur,
Bonjour.
vous allez bien?
Monty.
Ah,
Oui, oui,
c'est
très bien.
enchanté de venir nous voir quand même, c'est très gentil. Vous pouvez rentrer? C'est pas interdit, hein? Mais je vais vous faire visiter mon jardin. Entrez, entrez.
Je crois que vous jardiniez ici
Oui.
jusqu'à 40 ans.
Oui, 39 ans je suis là. 39 ans
oui.
je suis là.
Oui.
J'ai commencé en 1973. Voilà.
C'est changé
Alors, voyez?
depuis then?
Oui. Non, c'est toujours le même.
Toujours le même.
C'est toujours le même. J'ai toujours...
Et
savez-
vous êtes toujours le même.
Ah ben oui, ben,
vous
moi,
n'avez pas changé.
avec des années en plus. Hein. Attention de pas glisser.
Ok.
Regardez tout ce que je cultive. Et toute seule.
Oui.
Personne m'aide. Toute seule. Regardez.
C'est formidable. Et vous avez des fleurs?
Ah, j'ai une partie fleurs.
Oui.
Là, c'est toute ma partie fleurs. Et là, tout potager. Et je fais des légumes pour tout mon été. Pour même des conserves pour l'hiver. Vous voyez? Alors ça, c'est des pois mange-tout.
Oui.
Là, c'est des choux-fleurs.
Des choux-fleurs,
Des choux-fleurs. Mes tomates. Ça, c'est mes courgettes.
Les courgettes.
Ça, c'est mes
bon.
courgettes. Il faut faire un petit peu de tout. Hein. Je fais de tout. Ça, ce sont des concombres.
Oui, vraiment, beaucoup de concombres.
Ah oui. Et puis, ça donne. Hein.
Ouais.
Oh, il donne. J'en donne à beaucoup de monde ici. On partage.
Ah, share it.
Je mets la laine.
It strikes me that Eliane's allotment shares as much with its British counterpart as it does with a French potager.
Ça, c'est bon, ben,
Merci.
au revoir. Et puis, je vous donne un petit machin.
Oh,
comme ça.
merci.
Et comme ça, vous serez là-bas, vous penserez au jardin.
Merci, madame.
Comme ça.
Vous êtes très gentille.
Vous allez vous régaler.
Ok. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Et merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Merci. Au revoir. Au revoir.
Oh, that feels like a jar. Aha. So nice of it. Chutney, I think. Prune. 2011. Prune, actually jam, it looks like. There is something about the Freemasonry of gardeners, and particularly allotmenteers, that transcends nation and age and circumstance, and is just filled with a kind of benign, easy generosity. And of course it makes you feel like a bit of a heel turning up. Well, I want to see what else I've got. And taking gifts and not leaving anything in return. But actually it sows the seeds of something good. Look, there's other pots of jam in there, there's lettuce, there's all kinds of things. And me, a stranger. And actually the goodwill that produces does ripple through, and you know, there's something about allotments and these places that is a sort of lingua franca. It's different. All the flowers and trees are different to any allotment I've seen in England, but you know where you are, you feel at home.
Like most of her fellow allotmenteers, Eliane was not born in Paris. The allotments are the urban version of a tradition that comes from the deep rural heart of France and is nowadays found most readily here, back down in the south.
Ah, voilà le café.
Et voilà, monsieur. Un petit peu de lait avec?
Oui, c'est bien chaud?
Oui.
Merci.
It's easy to underestimate how very different these two cultures are. If the classic kitchen garden of the north is the rich man's decorative potager, then the south has the productive plot of the paysan, who supports his family off their small piece of land. I've come back to the Cevennes to visit a couple I've got to know who live a 21st century version of this paysan way of life.
One of the things that fascinates me is that paysan, or peasant, is an honourable state in France, whereas if you call someone a peasant in England, you're not really being flattering. And the peasant culture was very simply just living off the land. The peasants were people who fed themselves and fertilised their fields and looked after their animals off the land they had. And it might have been very small indeed. Now, do I go left or right? I think I go left. And that still remains something that the French practice and, more importantly, respect. And all their food culture
stems from that you grow your food on the patch of land you have.
This is Le Jardin de Sambuc, hewn by Nicolas and Agnès Brouquin out of rocky land, which was once her grandmother's chicken run. They have a small cafe here and grow almost all the food for it themselves.
Here we are. This is where I'm supposed to go. I think I'm blocking the road. Okay, let's move on. Pardon. Here we are. God, it's grown. Nicolas.
Monty, how are you?
I'm very well and very nice to see you. You've got your tooth.
Yes,
Pardon.
yes. Took a long time. I have them now.
You look very handsome.
Ah, you remember that.
When I came here last time, Nicolas was missing one front tooth and he looked very dashing and piratical.
I was looking like a pirate.
You were, exactly what I thought.
How are you, Monty?
Très bien, merci. Very nice to see you.
Not too hot?
No way, it's hot. It is hot.
It's going to be very hot.
Is it? Is it?
The Cevennes has long attracted an alternative lifestyle, and the garden does have a touch of the hippie about it.
Well, snazzy.
But there's a real charm in the stone paths that corkscrew round the slopes and the loose, untrammeled planting. The garden nestles into the wild landscape that surrounds it and provides precious shade from the searing sun. But unlike the elaborate decorative potagers of the north, the vegetables are grown separately on a plot down the road. It's 40 degrees today, and yet last winter it went down to -17.
Voilà, a little bit of air.
Here's a breeze, yeah.
A little bit. But now.
And yet Nicolas manages to grow all the fruit and vegetables for his family and for their small cafe. And I want to see how he goes about it.
So here
The
strawberries.
Have they been good this year?
Yes, yes, perfect. Perfect. Strawberry likes cold winter.
Cold winter,
Yeah.
hot summer.
Yeah, that's it.
And water.
And water. So
Can I try a
yes.
strawberry?
Voilà.
Look at that. What variety are these?
That's Marat des Bois.
Marat des Bois.
Marat des Bois.
Ah, oui.
Very good.
Yes, I grow Marat des Bois.
it's one of the
My Marat des Bois are not as good as this. Slightly perfumed. Lovely. I just look. Your soil is so stony.
Yes, we have a lot of stone.
You have a massive
Yes,
stone.
yeah. But that's very good because it heats the earth.
So the stone heats up.
Heats up the earth, and it keeps the water also. We have a natural mulch.
Of stone.
Mulch, one says?
Yes, mulch, yeah, very good.
Stone is very good for mulching. Yeah.
But quite hard work.
Yes, it's not an easy soil. Yes.
Okay. They used to say where I live, they say the soil will break your back.
Yeah.
Maybe break your heart, but never break your bank balance.
Very nice. yeah.
I like your tools.
Yes.
What do you call this in French?
This is more a sap.
Sap.
Probably, yes.
We say mattock.
Voilà.
Or in fact, where I come from, it's called a stocker.
And what do you do with that?
You chop weed.
The weed, yes.
Yeah.
But it must be more sharp. Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Or you turn the soil over.
Okay,
You
okay.
know, you
Okay.
like that.
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
digs, it's good.
But here we have this one. This is a special Cevennes. Voilà.
That's good, that's heavy.
This is
isn't
called
it?
a bigot. A bigot.
A bigot.
Bigot, yeah. Here everybody has one.
Everyone has a bigot. You see,
yeah.
in England you very rarely see that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Typic from here.
It's heavy.
Yes.
Hard work.
Yes. Hard work. It's quite a hard land, so it goes together. But this goes very well. This is broken one, of course. Like that.
Nicolas doesn't just grow strawberries. He cultivates everything, from potatoes to aubergines, via 15 different varieties of tomatoes, and it's all organic.
Do you grow all the vegetables, or do you have to buy some in?
We buy some in at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
Because we grow most of our vegetables, but in the beginning of the season we have to buy a few because we don't have any plastic tanner.
And what about in winter, when you have this very cold, harsh weather? Do you have enough vegetables for yourselves?
Oh yes, we have our potatoes, our poireaux.
Yeah.
Poireaux. We eat a lot of soups.
Yeah.
Soups every day.
Yeah.
Midday in the evening.
Makes me hungry.
Voilà.
To think about
and
it.
then we eat a little bit more of meat also in winter to get a little bit fatter.
Yeah.
To pass the winter.
The way that Nicolas coaxes so much from this difficult soil and climate is truly impressive and seems to me to be the embodiment of modern paysan self-sufficiency. And then Agnès transforms it all into a pretty plateful.
Oh, that looks so beautiful.
Voilà. Let's have a small meal.
Let's.
After this walk
Let's have a meal.
in the garden. These are goat cheese.
Fantastic.
Rolled in menthe. Voilà.
And the lovely flowers.
Voilà. Oh, there's souci.
Yeah.
Souci. A lot of soucis.
Yeah, my God.
Bourrache.
Right.
Bourrache. And
Rose.
this. Rose. Voilà.
Fantastic.
Voilà.
Very good.
Okay.
Good.
The trend here, as in the UK, is for merging smaller farms to create larger ones, although more than a quarter of French farmers still own less than 15 acres. Most of Nicolas' neighbours grow just one thing, the speciality of the region. I go up the other side of the valley to meet his friend Bruno to take a look.
Bonjour.
Vous avez des oignons.
Oui,
Le plus mieux oignon dans le monde entier, je crois.
le plus doux, on va dire, le
Ok.
plus doux.
Ah, bien.
Voilà, donc cultivé sur des
Et
terrains.
cette région, c'est la spécialité pour les oignons?
Oui.
Pourquoi?
Oui.
Pourquoi?
Ben, c'est ancestral, c'est une culture qui est très très ancienne.
C'est le climat, le terroir?
Le climat, le terroir. Au départ, c'était un légume qui était cultivé pour la consommation, parce que c'était un légume qui se conservait très bien. Donc les gens, au départ, ils le cultivaient pour avoir un légume tout l'hiver.
Oui.
Voilà.
Oui, c'est tout l'oignon.
Tout.
Dans les terrasses.
Oui. Oui, oui.
Bon.
Voilà.
Bon, j'aime beaucoup des fleurs. C'est à vous?
Oui, oui,
oui.
C'est les dames qui mettent un peu.
Qu'est-ce que c'est en français dahlia? En anglais, on dit dahlia.
Dahlia.
C'est le même mot?
Oui.
Well, dahlia.
Dahlia. Ouais.
Bon, merci. Merci beaucoup.
Ben, c'est avec plaisir.
Okay, au revoir.
Bruno harvests his entire crop of onions by hand in August and sells them via a small local cooperative.
It's interesting what Bruno was saying, because he's the fifth generation of his family to grow onions here. And also, what I find amazing, what's nice to hear a bell. That's the 6:05 bell. What I find amazing is that not only are onions produced in this very specific region that are acknowledged to be the finest in France, but also they have no rotation. There have been onions on these terraces continuously for over 100 years, and they still grow wonderfully well.
I love the idea of terroir, that specific combination of place, soil and climate, which means that one location can produce onions distinct from anywhere else. And of course, it's not just onions.
This is really interesting. Here you've got strawberries from Carpentras and from the Ardèche, and then different variety there. Now, the English gardener is really familiar with growing different varieties of strawberry and choosing which one they want. But the English shopper tends to just buy strawberries. And the real difference with France is that the housewife, the chef, the consumer will very deliberately select the variety or the region that food comes from with the same care that we grow it in England.
Those look particularly nice. Oui, c'est vraiment très parfumé.
Ah oui, c'est très parfumé.
Merci. C'est 2 euros.
2 euros.
Merci beaucoup. They're said to be exceptionally fragrant, and they really are. You know how with the strawberry, there's that moment of bliss when you realise that it's not just as good as you thought it was going to be, but a lot better.
This love of provenance and terroir is still alive in modern France. 26% of farms have disappeared in the last 10 years, mostly small holdings being absorbed by larger farms. And for these small farms, it can prove a lifeline. The Dordogne, for example, used to be a major tobacco growing area, but now farmers have had to adapt. The Boyer family in Kazakh, like many others, are using the land for a regional speciality. I've come to see Thierry Boyer in the old tobacco fields by the river.
Bonjour.
Hello.
Hello.
C'est l'asperge. C'est l'asperge de Carsac. Carsac-Kayak.
Mais c'est bien joli. Où est-il? Ah, voilà. Ah, montez-moi.
Donc comment on coupe une asperge?
Ouais.
Donc on plante, assez profond. On va toucher l'asperge.
Ouais.
On la tient avec la main, on coupe et on lève.
That's it.
On rebouche. Asperge blanche.
Ouais.
Voilà.
Ça, c'est mieux que l'asperge verte.
Oui. C'est
différent.
C'est différent. Pour nous, c'est l'asperge qu'on mange dans le sud-ouest, en France. Il y a cette asperge dans le sud-ouest et dans le nord de la France. Par contre, le sud de la France, c'est plus asperge verte. Et l'Angleterre, apparemment.
Oui, c'est vrai.
On peut en trouver une autre. Hein.
Oui.
Là.
Ah, voilà.
Bon.
Allez, à vous.
Merci. So we go in underneath on the side until I feel it. Oh, there it is. Right, I missed. Voila.
Good.
I'm going to have another go now.
These white asparagus are more expensive than our own green asparagus.
Merci. Okay, in here.
But the French love them and will pay accordingly.
Voilà.
Pour dîner.
Mais la terre, c'est très souple. C'est des terres d'alluvion. Hein.
Oui.
Avant, ici, la rivière a dû passer.
Oui.
Et c'est ça, la terre est riche, très riche. Et très bonne, très bonne. Légère.
Light, drains well, rich. C'est parfait pour l'asperge.
Parfait, ici, parfait.
But what's also interesting about these asparagus is that they are organic, bio as the French call it, and the amount of bio production has more than doubled in the last 10 years.
Oh, probably a one-way road, but who cares?
There's one statistic which I find truly enviable. The French spend more time eating and drinking than anyone else in the Western world. So I want to see what happens when you marry the traditional values of self-sufficiency and respect for local varieties with modern organic production and a Michelin-starred restaurant. There is, however, a minor hitch. I've run out of cash to pay the ferryman.
There's always something about going by ferry, even if you're just going across a little waterway. River. It's exciting. It's an unmodern thing to do. It's an adventure. I don't know what you expect to happen at the other end, but it's different. Life is going to change somehow. And it's so short. I've got to get back in the car, else I'll be left stranded here and get into trouble. But that was fun. That was good.
Although I couldn't pay the fare, I was allowed across the River Rhône on my way to the Camargue. This is the dead-flat, marshy stretch of land that merges into the Mediterranean. famous for its wild rice and white horses. And I've come here to visit a restaurant with an unusually intimate relationship with its kitchen garden.
Now, this is the reason that I've come to the Camargue, because this restaurant, La Chassonnette, is bio, meaning it's organic. It grows all its own veg and was one of the first organic restaurants to get a Michelin star.
As the guests eat, they look out onto a garden that not only provides most of the ingredients for their meal, but it's also lovely.
Nice to see the cosmos. This is Cosmos Dazzler. And I actually, funnily enough, just before coming out here, planted mine out back home. They're nothing like as big, but look at the way that the new flower is that very rich, reddy colour, almost plum, and then it fades to a pink. It looks lovely, just scattered through the vegetables. I'm looking for Claude, the gardener. Claude, bonjour. Ça va?
Ça va et toi?
Oui, très bien.
Tu viens voir le jardin?
Oui.
Ah, c'est bien. Tu
Bon.
vas bien?
Oui.
Ça va?
Ah, ça va. Voilà des tomates.
Voilà les tomates.
À quel type de tomates?
Alors là, sur le jardin, je cultive environ 30 variétés. Oui.
Waouh!
Ouais. Tu vois, regarde, des tomates. Bien. Alors elles sont un peu déformées, mais le goût est.
Le goût, c'est le.
Le goût, c'est terrible, quoi. Ce sont des tomates qui pourraient mal se conserver. Il faut manger mûr sur place.
Oui.
Voilà, pour profiter vraiment de la qualité de la tomate.
See, what that has is it has a sort of tenderness to touch that you never get in an English tomato because it never gets that ripe. English tomatoes tend to be much firmer. And although it may look less than perfect, I can tell you the taste, I just want to bite into that. I mean, the taste is fantastic. Ah, it's enormous. Oh.
Grosse cœur de bœuf.
That is a whopper. It's the size of a great big baking apple or a small melon. And of course what you have is the warmth of the sun. A cold tomato has far less taste. So this smells of days of sunshine.
Tu vois la chair de la tomate.
The flesh.
Tu vois?
So the flesh here is really solid. There is no sort of wet, pippy section. Wait. So it's got body. This is a muscular tomato. This has been in the weights room, pumping iron, and the result is, and it's like a watermelon in sort of scale. It's got a different texture now. It's very, very nice. It's lovely.
These tomatoes go from the vine to the kitchen in minutes. No food could be fresher.
Hello, Armand. Bonjour. How are you?
Good, very good.
Very good. So what are you cooking today?
Today we prepare fish with tomatoes.
Yeah.
So we have these tomatoes. And we confit in olive oil.
So that's just olive oil there, right?
Olive oil and basil.
And the basil is from the garden, yeah?
Yes. Go ahead.
Ready? Okay. Superb. Superb.
Just with the fish with the olive oil like this. This tomato is going to be used as a seasoning of the fish.
Does it matter which variety you use for this?
Today, the noir de Crimée we use because we want not too acid, but concentrate and a lot of density in the tomato.
Right.
Okay?
So you choose your variety for the dish.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I also prepare some onions.
So that is so far all from the garden?
Everything's from the garden.
Right. So when you organize your menu, do you see what's in the garden?
Exactly. It's we can say it's it's a garden who dictate what's gonna be in the card. Okay.
Yeah.
The idea is to have a restaurant who helps the garden and not the garden for the restaurant.
But that's unusual, isn't it?
Yes, it's
It is
unusual.
rare. I mean, as a gardener, as someone who grows food, that is wonderful. Because when you're cooking at home, you go into the garden, you see what's good, you gather it, and you cook it.
Yeah. So it's a garden who decides what's gonna be
So-
for you.
And did you at home? Did your parents grow vegetables?
No, but my grandparents used to sell vegetables on the market.
Okay.
So vegetables is always part of my life.
So that's very good. I'll let you get on because I know
Thank
you're
you.
going to be very, very busy. But thank you very much. It's
Thank you.
fascinating.
This place is a perfect example of how the directness of paysan culture can be maintained and celebrated without compromising the highest culinary standards. It's been a fascinating journey, from the self-sufficiency of the nuns to the embellishment of Val Joannis and the uncomplicated flavours of the Cevennes. And I've seen how the French love of order and control turns pruning into a fine art and vegetables into formal bedding. And there is no doubt that the French passion for food goes hand in hand with a pride in terroir and an appreciation that choosing the particular and specific will always translate into the best you can eat.
C'est bon.
But it's time to pay a visit to the French kitchen garden that I think combines all these qualities into one triumphant performance. It is in Berry, which is in La France Profonde, right in the middle of the country.
Here we go.
I think that this place succeeds in marrying the virtues of a high level of productivity, theatrical and playful display, and the French delight in good food, all in one glorious garden. The potager at the ancient monastery of Prieuré Notre-Dame d'Auxon is only 20 years old. But it takes its inspiration from the site and the tenets of medieval monastic gardens, where everything should be both useful and beautiful.
This is a block of wheat growing in the lawn. Now you might think that that is quirky, fun, a little bit eccentric, but actually it's very, very practical. Like everything else in this garden, it's grown to eat. It'll be harvested, and the grains will be ground and made into bread. And there's no reason why you can't grow anything edible in a garden. There isn't an area that's suitable for farming and an area that's suitable for gardening. The two can come together. And I think that gives an energy to a garden. If you're really going to use it, you're really going to grow it as well as you can. But here, whether it's eaten or not, everything, down just to protection around the crop, down to the little snails on top of the bamboos, must look good.
The owner, Patrick Taravella, is an architect turned garden designer, and he's asked me to lunch.
Oh, there we go. Lovely, that looks very beautiful.
I hope you like the vegetables.
I love vegetables. All these from the garden?
All is from the garden, yes.
How did you begin the garden here? Perhaps why did you begin the garden here?
The first summer, it was so warm, so hot, that I say we have to plant a tree because we need shade. It was everywhere was rain, we had no roof, no shade everywhere, and we want shade. And 1 tree, 2 trees, 3 trees, and if we make a garden, just like that.
And you'd never made a garden before?
No, never. Never. It's my first garden.
So, why did you want to make a garden that included food, and vegetables and fruit?
Because for me, a flower, I like the flower on the tree, because I say there is a fruit after.
Yeah.
Not the flower to cut, to put in, on the table. I can do, but it's not my interest.
Patrick now runs the converted monastery as a small hotel. And everything that is grown in the garden is served to the guests as it comes into season.
There isn't a gardener that doesn't use support of some kind. I don't think I've ever seen a garden where the support systems look so good. It's not particularly original, but the way that it's all put together actually is really inspiring and exciting. So this, for example, these are tomatoes. And there are wigwams. There's this nice sort of tent-like structure, which I'm going to copy. A roller coaster lattice work there, all to support tomatoes. There's a playfulness about it that I like, because it's all practical, it's all standard stuff, but there's a little spark to it.
Although the garden is not particularly big, it feels big because it's subdivided into dozens of compartments, and it's easy to get lost with peepholes and views and a maze of hedge-lined paths. Now, there's a reference to medieval symbolism in all this, following a tortuous road to salvation, but it is above all a brilliant manipulation of space.
Space is constricted, it's expanded, you're led down certain alleys that lead nowhere, there are dead ends, you have to retrace your steps, there are little windows, there are doors. All this makes it very lively and energetic and exciting, because you don't know what's round the corner. I think this garden weaves together its different strands brilliantly. You've got the monastic element, where monks grow food with devotion. You've got serious food production, which is served to paying members of the public to a very high standard. And you've got a garden that is just purely sets out to look beautiful. And they all come together. I love the way nothing is wasted. Everything, be it a rose or a cabbage, is grown with great seriousness. But the tone and the way the garden looks and feels has a real playful element. It's elegant and it's useful. Now, surely, that's the definition of a potager.
Next time, I'll be looking at gardens of great French artists and considering the question of whether a garden can be a work of art in itself.
My goodness.
Still to come here on BBC HD, Stephen Fry with a plethora of QI facts, all beginning with J. That's coming up next.
What images does France conjure up for you? Now, for me, there are beautiful houses and gardens of all kinds, but also glorious markets, street cafes, and some very formative experiences.
When I was 19, I came to the south of France and lived in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months. And ever since then, I've loved France and everything to do with it. And I want to share that passion for the country with you through its gardens.
I'll be travelling the byways of the French countryside.
This is what a deux chevaux was made for.
Meeting local gardeners.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Monty. Bonjour, José.
Tasting the very best of their harvest.
Sometimes this job is really good.
Getting to turn on huge fountains.
I can hear the water.
And trying to find out what makes French gardens, and indeed the French, unique.
Today, I shall be looking both at the gardens of artists and gardens that are works of art in their own right.
I'll be visiting gardens portrayed by painters like Claude Monet and Paul Cézanne, as well as the work of France's most interesting contemporary designers. And I'll be trying to find out at what point the French think that a garden transcends horticulture and becomes a work of art. This is Café Nemours, in the heart of Paris, just round the corner from the Louvre.
Un qui, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Paris has always attracted artists and intellectuals.
I remember my grandfather, who died 30 years ago when he was nearly 100, telling me how that he came and lived and worked in Paris in 1901. And that it was a very sexy, free city where they did the can-can and there was the Moulin Rouge. Paris was somewhere that was sophisticated, where art was respected and was very creative. So just to come and sit and watch street life go by was more exciting than anything else you could get in Britain. Still is.
That sense of creative freedom can perhaps be dated back to the exhibition at the Louvre in 1863, which included for the first time the early work of a radical group of artists, now known as the Impressionists. Painting directly from nature, painters like Paul Cézanne and Claude Monet embraced light and colour as their central themes, attempting to capture the essence of a single moment in their canvases. And gardens, nature at its most domestic and accessible, were to be a common subject of their paintings. A series of the most famous of all Impressionist paintings are displayed here in the Orangerie in the Tuileries Gardens. They are the 8 Nymphae, Monet's canvases of water lilies, inspired by the water garden he created and then painted again and again.
Of course, the really overwhelming thing is the scale. These are simply enormous paintings. They're bigger than most ponds. The scale is celestial. What's really interesting is that these have become almost completely abstract. It's as though Monet has immersed himself so closely and nearly with what he's painting. I mean, I see him standing right close to the canvas, that he's not really painting the garden anymore. He's painting what the garden means. He's painting light and colour and the fact that it's water. It's bouncing off and it's becoming abstract and metaphysical. And that's beautiful. That's inspiring. But he's taken the garden and gone beyond.
To find out more about Monet's paintings, I want to go to the source of his inspiration. So I'm leaving Paris and going northwest to visit his garden in Normandy that he made in a small village on the banks of the Seine.
This is Giverny, the garden of Claude Monet, and it's a garden I know. I've been here twice before, but never before in April.
Monet found this old cider farm in the village of Giverny in the spring of 1883, when he was looking for a home to rent for his young and growing family. At the age of 43, he was already an experienced gardener and was to spend the remaining 43 years of his life obsessed by this garden. As soon as he moved in, he set to work transforming the orchard in front of the farmhouse.
The first thing that strikes me is how fresh everything is. When I came here first time, it was high summer, and actually it was surprisingly, not drab, that's the wrong word, but it was overwhelmed with foliage and in-between colour phases. And then when I came here in late spring, the colour was incredibly intense, but now there is a lightness and almost sort of the colours dance above the borders. It's lovely.
Monet laid the garden out in blocks of colour like an artist's palette, mixing simple flowers like daisies and poppies with more unusual varieties like the species tulips. In fact, he grew increasingly particular about the exact varieties that would give him the texture and colour he wanted to paint. And once said, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." In the process of making the garden, he transformed the site. But he didn't always get his own way.
This central alley was flanked, when he came here, with trees. There were fir trees and yew trees. Now, he cut some down and put up these arches on the site of where the trees were. But his wife Alice wouldn't let him cut down the fir trees that were there, although they were clearly pretty horrid and inappropriate. So he kept them, but then he obviously worked on her for a bit because he was allowed to cut all off except for the trunks, which looked really odd. They looked like fat telegraph poles, and he grew roses up them. But then, when she died, with a sort of due period of mourning for tree and wife, he came out and he cut them down.
Monet began painting this part of the garden, which is called the Clos Normand, as soon as he moved in, and continued to do so for the rest of his life. He kept a strict daily routine, rising at dawn and going outside to catch the light. And unlike the hordes of tourists, all trying to snap the whole essence of the garden in one killer shot, this meant that he often worked systematically on a number of canvases simultaneously, moving from one to the other around the garden as the light changed. To maintain the right intensity of colour, he thought nothing of ripping out hundreds of flowers and replacing them almost daily, which is how the garden is still run. James Priest is the English head gardener whose job it is to maintain Monet's legacy.
One of the things I'm interested in is the relationship between artists and gardens. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very good parallel. Is that the artist is working obviously on canvas, but we're working both with a picture to make and our tools of plants, whereas the artist is using paints, but we're making something according to what theme. And artists have different movements, gardeners have different styles. So we decide on the style we want, and we're trying to make something the most beautiful, harmonious, and the true to a feeling, because an artist to my mind, doesn't just make something that's real and cold. He makes something that has depth to it and feeling and emotion to it. So I think the parallel is very, very close. Monet had to know his colors and how to mix them and how to use them. I have to know my flowers and the colors, how to use them. So technically, two different techniques, but the final result is very comparable.
Do you think Monet was a good gardener or not?
I think that at the end of his life, he was a good gardener. I think at the beginning of his life, like all of us, he had to learn what gardening was about, and so he started very simply.
But it took time.
It took time. It took all his life, yes.
Today, over 600,000 people a year come to appreciate Monet the gardener. 10 years after he first moved to Givigny, Monet sold enough paintings to enable him not only to buy the house and Clos Normand, but also a plot of land over the road and begin to make his famous water garden. The water lilies are not yet in flower, so I shall make a return visit to see them later in the summer. I'm now going south on the TGV to visit a very different garden, which was also the inspiration for a painter that I love. He was a contemporary and friend of Monet's called Paul Cézanne. This means retracing the steps of my much younger self. But back then, the journey from Paris to Marseille took all night, and now it's a mere 3 hours.
The last time I made this journey by train was 1974. I was 19 and looking for light, really. I've become entranced by the paintings of Paul Cézanne and the way that he used light and landscape. And I was completely besotted by this idea of this bright, strong light filtered through landscape and through trees, because by then I was gardening a lot, and I felt a sort of deep emotional attraction to growth and soil and landscape, and I painted a little bit. And to see it all come together was thrilling. So down I came, and it was a big adventure.
I still have my journal from those days, and it records the excitement and wonder I felt on my first visit into the light of the South.
Sunday the 13th of October, 1974, I woke at 7 to find myself in broad Provençal sunshine with a train at Arles. I spent the rest of the journey gazing at Provence. Misty blue mountains, blue sparkling sea, white gleaming rock, olive trees, cypress, firs. So beautiful. Here's me at 19, proudly showing my new berry. I'd obviously just bought that.
I change trains and travel on to Aix-en-Provence. And when I get there, I go straight back to visit some old haunts.
This is Rue Portalis, where I lived when I was in Aix. And it was there, number 20. And I was up on the second floor.
The market is still here at the square at the end of the street. I'd come here and scavenge the leftovers, which were nicer than anything I could get in Britain.
This is a mobilette. I had one similar to it, not actually quite so good, because this is a Solex, where the engine was in front. Mine was underneath. But this curious hybrid of bicycle and motorbike that were really common 30, 40 years ago, hardly ever see them now. But I was set off bravely, tearing along at 20 miles an hour. And if things got a bit dodgy or you ran out of fuel, you could pedal.
The main reason I was here was to get closer to the paintings that so inspired me. Paul Cézanne was born in Aix in 1839, and he lived here most of his life. He painted the area ceaselessly, distilling the essence of the landscape and the southern light onto canvas. Cézanne lived in his parental home, the Jardin de Bouffin, and painted the garden in every season. Back in the 1970s, I thought that if I went to see the garden, it would teach me something about Cézanne's paintings. But it didn't prove to be that easy.
I wanted to find a Jardin de Bouffin, which I knew was where Cézanne was brought up and where he lived most of his life, actually. And I thought maybe that I could go in and walk around, but anyway, it was no use because the gates were firmly locked and it seemed to be very closed down. It was scruffy, there didn't seem to be any signs of life, no one going in or out, so I hung around for a bit and went away again. Anyway, I now know that I can go in, nearly 40 years later, and at last have a look around.
The garden is very simple. It isn't filled with flowers like Giverny, but Cézanne loved to paint the lines of the trees and the light and the shade filtering through the branches. And all the features that are so recognizable from his paintings are still here. The plane trees, the pool, and the rather grand house itself. In fact, it seems almost untouched since he lived here.
I've got some postcards of Jardin de Bouffin. I want to match them up and see. I mean, it is a very imposing house. See, that's that sort of thing. If you look, there's the house. That's good. Actually, looking at that, I've got another postcard. See, look at that. That postcard there is that. And there's the pond, look. There's the pond, the corner of the pond, which is there. There's the path, much narrower, and there the avenue, exactly there. So he's standing here and painting that. And in fact, even that little bit there is this here. Is that. That's good. You see, what's exciting about that is that it's not just identifying it. For me, a garden is home, is life, is childhood, memory, dreams, all bound up. You can't separate it. So where Cézanne walked in the garden, let alone where he painted in the garden, connects you to him in a way, means you smell the same smells, you hear the same things. You know, he would have heard the water trickling. And I think that's just thrilling. I think that's really living, breathing history in a way that just a postcard can't do.
When Cézanne was 60, His mother died, and the house and garden had to be sold. Cézanne built himself a small studio and garden a couple of miles away on the other side of Aix.
It is very lovely. It's one's idea of a villa in the middle of a hot day. And he built it to live in, but he never did. He then transformed it into a studio, but came up here to work every day. And he made a garden from what was farmland. And actually, the garden is not much to look at now, and apparently it never was. The garden wasn't important to him in a horticultural sense. But what he loved and painted a lot were the lines and shapes of stems and branches and light and colour filtering through. So it mattered to him, and also having that sort of safety zone around him. This was absolutely his space and clearly fired his creativity. Now it's sort of been let go, and it's interesting. If this was England and this was National Trust, it would be fully restored to exactly the date when Cézanne made it. But I rather like the way that it's just become itself, and rather suspect that Cézanne would have liked it too.
The garden may have been allowed to grow wild, but the studio is beautifully preserved. And it does feel as though Cézanne has just walked out of the room.
There's a letter to Monet, dated 6th of July, 1895. It's been said of Cézanne that he painted still lives like landscape, and landscape like still lives. And yet he was one of the first people to paint still lives as though he'd just caught them, as though he just got their essence before it drifted away. And that has a spiritual quality and is incredibly beautiful. And in a way, it's not fanciful to compare that to gardening, is that when you're making a garden, or even just enjoying a garden, there is that profound sense of just being in the moment, and you share it. And you know it's going to change, the weather will change, the plant will move on, and it'll never be the same again. But just for a second, you were precisely there. And that's what Cézanne's painting immediately gave me, and have given lots of other people.
I may have had to wait 40 years to come and see his home and gardens, but it's certainly increased my understanding of Cézanne's work.
By coming and walking through his garden and looking at it and letting the light fall and just sitting in it quietly, I've realised something very profoundly that I hadn't quite got from looking at the pictures, which is that it's ordinary. It's just like lots of other people's gardens, bigger than most, but the contents are the same. Nothing special here at all. And what, of course, Cézanne did was take those ordinary elements and utterly transform them. Through genius, he made the private and the domestic, the back garden, into something that everybody in the world realises as truly great art.
Cézanne didn't need to create a garden for it to inspire his art. But the next garden I want to show you was self-consciously made as a work of art in itself. To get there, I am reunited with my favourite French car, but I can't resist just revisiting a scene that Cézanne painted many times.
I'm driving a 2CV on a twisty, windy Provençal road. On the wrong side of the road is slightly marked. Here we go.
When I was here as a teenager, I worked in a garden just outside Aix. I loved the journey there because the road took me past the spot where Cézanne repeatedly set up his easel to paint the great outcrop of Mont Saint-Victoire.
Oh, look, you see, there's Mont Saint-Victoire. Incredible view. That still thrills me. What are we now? All this time, I've seen it lots of times, and it's still thrilling. You can imagine what it was like as a 19-year-old. It's exciting now as it was then. So every time I saw it, I was in the painting. I was here in the place where the painting was. And that was such a buzz.
Cézanne painted Mont Saint-Victoire over 80 times. And through his paintings, one can chart his move towards abstraction. By the time he died in 1906, he was increasingly using blocks of colour to build semi-abstract forms. This later work of Cézanne helped inspire a radical new art movement, Cubism. I've come 65 miles to the Riviera town of Hyères to see the world's first Cubist garden.
I couldn't get any breakfast at the hotel, and although it's great being able to get in early and see the garden, I've got to have some coffee before I start. I can't think.
The central idea of Cubism is to show a subject from several perspectives at the same time, and it revolutionized the world of art and architecture.
The garden I'm heading off to see at this time of day is called Villa Noailles, and it was made in the 1920s as the first truly modern garden in France, because it's a Cubist garden, and was deliberately made really as a continuation of the paintings that the Cubists did and the sculptures. So it's part garden, part work of art. And what I don't know is if it's still maintained as it was, if it's retained that sense of sort of shocking new experimental art. But I'll find out when I've had a cup of coffee.
In 1927, Charles and Marie-Laure de Noailles, aristocratic and hugely wealthy patrons of modern art, decided to build a holiday villa, complete with a Cubist garden. What was unusual, even groundbreaking, was that they commissioned the designer, Gabriel Gavrekian, to make the garden expressly as a work of art.
I was quite worried before coming to see this, because although I'd seen lots of pictures, it looked a bit scruffy, and I couldn't quite see how that it would work as a garden. But it does. It's a relief, because it's all sorts of things. It's charming, it's a piece of history, and it's definitely a piece of art.
It was originally planted with tulips and standard citrus, but from the outset, the plants were always secondary to the planes and shapes of Gavrekian's design. It's as though he's taken recognizable elements of the garden, like a gravel path, and reassembled them in different dimensions to create his work.
It's very nice once you're inside it. It's very different, actually, because all the different levels are really working. And although there are no paths, it actually feels reasonable to go. You feel like a chess piece on a chessboard. My move. And it's a very friendly space, I suppose, which is not a word you would associate really with Cubism. But it works. I like the way with Cubism that although there are no paths, the paths that there are, the gravel, is at an angle at the wall. So your eye's saying path, and yet it's not doing it. It's all part of that Cubist mentality of trying to unpick the world and put it back together again in a jumble that makes you see it with fresh eyes. This makes you see a garden with fresh eyes.
When it was made 85 years ago, this garden was revolutionary and challenged all perceptions of what a garden was or might be. The de Noailles kept open house for artists and intellectuals, making Villa Noailles, for a while, the most fashionable artistic centre in the whole of France. Pierre Quillet's grandfather was the butler here during that period.
Et le style de la vie ici, beaucoup des visiteurs.
énormément. Et puis beaucoup d'animations. Donc ça a donné beaucoup de fêtes dans la villa.
Et des artistes.
Beaucoup d'artistes. Même à la limite, c'était devenu très difficile pour un jeune artiste à l'époque de ne pas passer par les Noailles pour pouvoir réussir. Le plus célèbre, c'est Dali. Lancé par Charles et Marie-Laure de Noailles. À l'époque, ma mère me rapportait qu'il n'avait pas grand-chose à manger, donc il venait piter dans la cuisine pour manger en cachette.
If the planting hasn't stood the test of time, the structure of the garden certainly has, and it's still provocative and interesting. "60 miles north of Liège is another garden which has been bought and sold as a collector's item. Its every detail was created in direct artistic response to the landscape that surrounds it. But there's something I want to see on the way.
I'm just going to make a little detour because I've heard that there's a lavender field down here, and I want to see lavender growing in its natural habitat, so to speak. Look at that. The thing about lavender grown here is that it's got exactly the conditions it wants. So you've got this very dry limestone soil. Look at that, it's just powder in my hands. And look how healthy that is. It's just completely found where it wants to be. And when I do that, I'm surprised you can't see the air shimmer with scent. It's so rich and oily and quite heady, it's almost intoxicating. And what lavender loves is harsh, extreme conditions and really good drainage. But it's surprising that the cherries which we think of as Garden of England cherries, but they love it here. Just shows you what they really like. Not quite right, but lovely. That one looks better. Standing in the Provençal sunshine, next to a lavender field, eating cherries. That's quite good.
The garden I'm heading for is called La Louve and is set in some of the most beautiful countryside in the south of France.
Now it's up there somewhere. I'll find it.
It's in the village of Bogne, in the heart of the Luberon in Provence. I'm coming here to see it as a work of art, but it has also set the standard as the dream Provençal garden.
Good morning, bonjour.
The garden is modest in size and set on a steep slope in the middle of the village. It was made by Nicole de Vézien, a successful textile designer, using a style that is deceptively simple, based around native plants and natural materials.
I love the way that this garden picks up the rhythm of the place. It does it in a number of ways. The obvious ones are in the outlines and the shapes that follow the landscape. And that's very subtle. It shows that Nicole really looked and really observed and didn't copy, but just picked up on that flow and let it run through the garden.
Nicole didn't base her garden on any rare or unusual plants. These cypresses are native to the region, and lavender, of course, loves it here. It's not what she used, but how she used it, the artistry she employed, that makes La Louve so special. At every turn, there is a perfectly composed still life. Despite the very awkward site, La Louve works both as a lovely garden and as a work of art. And whilst it seems deceptively simple, it is in fact edited in every detail.
This garden is a really good example on how to make a small space seem bigger. And it does it by two ways. One is by filling it, and the other is by compressing space. And the easiest way to do that is by having your walkways and your entrances and exits really narrow. And by compressing them down so that you have to sort of squidge through almost and brush against the foliage, which is lovely because there's really good sense. It pushes space in, and then as you come out the other side, it releases it and makes it seem much bigger. And you'd be surprised at how that works every time.
At the age of 80, 10 years after starting La Louve, Nicole decided to sell her garden because she wanted to make a new one. The art collector Judith Pillsbury was the buyer, and she purchased it as a finished work of art.
It was just a coup de foudre. It was just so beautiful. It was like being able to buy Sissinghurst.
When one is buying into, literally and figuratively, into a garden that's very established, are you obliged to curate it?
Well, I think one is obliged to curate it. I mean, that's what I feel. And I'm an art dealer, so I'm used to taking care of works of art.
The idea of the artists creating their art through the medium of horticulture is one that interests me a lot. Do you think that it's practical, that one can do that?
I don't know that Nicole started out that way. I think that she was someone who just couldn't stop creating. And she had a vision of Provence, which at that time was very new. I mean, she embraced, you know, the vernacular of a peasant garden, hard scrabble, not very many plants. She embraced that, and she turned that into something that was a positive.
Nicole Vézien died 20 years ago, but her style of Provençal garden has become increasingly influential.
Although she made a world-famous garden, the irony is that Nicole de Vézien was conventionally no gardener. She didn't dig the garden at all. There was no attempt to return fertility. She never made compost. She planted much too close together. But she had an absolutely innate feel for two things. One was colour and the other was form. And the colours she's used here are very muted and faded, and they look terrific under a very bright sun. They have a kind of richness and subtle intensity, whereas if you use them under grey skies, that just looks drab. And the other thing that she just had a superb feel for was space. It's a sculptural quality. And her clipping and training, it wasn't just to do with organising the plants themselves, but the space between plants, the space between branches that catches light and the distant horizon is just exquisite. And that's gardening of real high quality. She may not have known how to grow the plants or even their names, but she sure knew how to make them look good.
I left here wondering whether you can make a garden, or indeed a work of art, by accident. Can one drift into the other, or must you set out with a clear purpose and vision? To try and answer this, I've decided to look to the present and ask three of France's contemporary designers what they think the relationship is between their gardens and art. One uses his plants as living sculpture. Another takes the elements of the traditional French formal garden and reinvents them to elegant effect. And the third creates gardens that climb vertically on the walls of inner-city buildings. This one is on the Quai Branly in Paris. But Patrick Blanc's work is now found all over the world, commissioned and displayed like paintings, neatly bridging the gap between gardens and art. I've come to see Patrick at his seemingly ordinary home in the south of Paris.
Hello, Patrick.
Hello.
Monkey. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
But inside, it's anything but ordinary.
Ah, so I can see.
Yes.
This at the end. My goodness.
Yeah, it's a kind of a tropical forest at home.
Because Patrick has his own indoor vertical garden.
Oh, now it's a little bit more than 3 years old.
Or as he calls it, a mur végétal, a wall of plants.
It's 3 years old.
Yes. And you see, each plant has its own place because there are about 250 species. Huh?
250 species here?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes.
Despite his growing fame as an artistic gardener, Patrick is first and foremost an academic botanist with an obsession for plants from tropical rainforests. And as rainforests account for over half the plant species on the planet, they're a rich source of material for his living wall.
Tell me, I mean, just technically, how do you fix them in? What are they growing in?
There are 2 sheets of felt, you see?
Yeah.
2 sheets, I open, and I put the plant just between the felt, and the roots are growing in the felt in the same way as they are growing among mosses covering the rocks in rainforest.
So they don't need any nutrients?
No. When you have, for instance, limestone cliffs, you have everywhere in Europe, and you see many species are growing as soon as there is some circulation of water. The only important thing is to choose the species which in nature are always growing on vertical or very oblique surfaces.
And how do you keep it watered?
Oh, it's very easy. At the top you have a hose with some holes.
So the water, you have a hose and it drips down?
Yes.
Inside this perfectly ordinary Parisian home, Patrick has created his own miniature ecosystem, complete with lizards, birds, and even an underfloor aquarium. Yet although this is quite unlike most gardens, the plants are still adapting and growing where it most suits them.
In the case of a vertical garden, you see the plant can escape much more. You see this ficus, Ficus villosa, for instance, which is here. I did plant here, it here. I didn't know it wanted to climb, but now it is at the top, and I think maybe it will be covering the ceiling.
Yeah.
So you see, there are with vertical garden there are many more surprises because plants are totally free.
Is this, do you think, I mean, other people have called this a work of art. Do you think of it as your artwork? Or do you think of it as your garden? Or both?
No, for me, it's my babies.
Your babies.
I like the exuberance of Patrick's living walls. This one is also in Paris and in the Rue de la Verrerie, and they've been much imitated around the world. Now, Patrick himself is clearly not concerned whether they're art or not, but they challenge the nature of a garden. And a lot of people enjoy them as living art. I'm now leaving Paris to head north, and the next gardener I'm going to meet has taken on a deeply serious subject: war and peace. His garden has been inspired by the countryside that it is set in and its long and troubled history. This landscape of northern France can feel very familiar to the British eyes. And it does look similar in many ways, but the really big difference is that in this landscape, war raged within living memory and was the scene of horrendous fighting and terrible losses. And the marks of that are still here, both physically, on the landscape itself, and in the community. The name of the garden that I'm heading towards is Sericourt, near the town of Arras. Sericourt is the creation of Yves Gosse de Gore. He was born and brought up here and identifies personally with the history of the surrounding battle-scarred landscape. This is what inspired him to create this large garden from scratch. The 11-acre garden is divided into many compartments, with the warrior garden at its heart.
Ici, c'est le jardin guerrier, warrior garden, with soldates here.
Ce sont des soldats.
Des soldats,
oui.
Oui.
Ranks of fastigiate Irish yews, each trimmed to an individual height, stand at the ready. Just beyond them are crude faces clipped from cypress.
Ah là là, ils sont quoi? Des visages?
Des visages. Nous appelons ça les masques guerriers.
Ah.
Warrior mask.
Oui, oui.
Yeah.
Yves loves the symbolism of plants, but the garden also includes direct images of the brutality that raged in this region just a few generations ago.
Qu'est-ce que c'est les trous?
Alors ici, ce sont des trous de bombes, des cratères.
Ah, les trous de bombes, bon.
Les cratères.
Ce n'est pas les vrais trous de bombes.
Non, ce n'est pas les vrais trous de bombes. On a voulu marquer un petit peu, si vous voulez, le terrain pour montrer que c'était une terre martyre ici, où il y a eu beaucoup de passages, beaucoup d'invasions. Hein. On n'est pas très loin donc d'Agincourt. Les 2 guerres mondiales se sont déroulées aussi ici. Donc c'est une terre qui a vraiment beaucoup souffert. Et c'était une façon de l'expliquer.
I never thought I'd say this, that a hole could be a beautiful thing.
Voilà, c'est un peu spécial de faire des trous dans le jardin comme
oui,
ça.
C'est spécial, c'est différent, mais c'est intéressant.
Oui. De temps en temps, on me demande quel arbre je vais planter là.
Everything in this garden has a story or a symbol attached to it.
Et cet endroit-là, cette avenue.
C'est l'allée de l'infini, qui symbolise en fait le fait que la guerre ne mène à rien, que c'est toujours une impasse. Donc il y a un peu dans le fond de la lumière qui symbolise l'espoir. Si on se place bien, on a la lumière.
Ah oui, pas de lumière.
Un tout petit peu de lumière.
Oui. Quand vous avez commencé ces jardins, est-ce que vous avez fait l'art ou le jardin?
Alors j'ai essayé de faire 3 choses en même temps. J'ai commencé par une collection de plantes et ensuite j'ai essayé de créer quelque chose avec ces plantes, de faire de l'art et puis de raconter en même temps une histoire. Les plantes en elles-mêmes, j'avais envie de les faire parler, j'avais envie de raconter une histoire à travers mon jardin.
Even though Yves started as a plantsman, he is, in a very French way, in love with the intellectual concepts that plants can express. But the garden's idiosyncrasies make it both very personal and yet accessible at every level.
This is a big garden and it's full of ideas, and every corner you turn there's something else going on. And what you feel like, it's a party, the door opens, and as a visitor, welcome it. Come and join it. And it's full of jostling, friendly humanity. Now that's pretty good for a garden. Not many gardens achieve that. But I think what doesn't work is there's no discrimination. And I think art has to leave out more than it includes. And you get a feeling here is nothing has been left out.
The last of these modern gardens is in Normandy, a couple of hours' drive away. And here, all that I've learnt about the French comes together in what I consider a hugely successful artistic work and a lovely garden. This is Le Jardin Plume, the feather garden, made over the past 15 years.
I first came here in winter, and it was very bleak and bare, but dramatic. and you could see what was going on, but you had to guess quite a lot. Because now it's all evident and visible, and I guess at its absolute best, and it's just a joy. Everywhere you look, there's such interesting things going on. For example, the planting goes from the very conventional and recognizable to really quite dramatically modern, using grasses in ways that, a lot of people would say are weeds, and that's not the way you do it. But because it's done so slickly and so well, it just feels sharp and utterly contemporary.
The use of grasses is now highly fashionable, but Sylvie and Patrick Quibel, who made this garden from an open field, have established the perfect interplay between formal structure and the flowing sensuality of the content. It is like beautifully cut clothes that fit perfectly and yet allow the fabric to move and perform.
So you can walk right in amongst the planting, and you have this incredible movement. The wind just sort of riffles through and fingers it. The sound, the texture, the way that you look through something to see everything else just works superbly well. It's a really, really good example of how you work with a space, even if it's an unlikely one, and let things go within constraints. That makes something really special.
The underlying design of this garden is based upon long-standing French formal gardening traditions, like the gardens at Versailles or Vaux-le-Vicomte, but expressed in a very modern way. So there are grandes allées, but they're created by mowing different heights of grass. The hedges are tightly clipped, but in flowing crests and waves. And there is formal water, but cut as another square into the mown grass.
Well, I suppose the big question is this garden a work of art, or is it just a beautiful garden? Certainly, it's full of very sculptural, artistic ideas. I mean, I think that this great block of green box is wonderful, thrilling you. Now, it's box, call it a hedge, call it anything you like. This is art for me. But the real way that this works is in the mind. It's got to be an idea. You've got to have the concept of art as a garden, and this is where the French excel. They love concepts. They're very good at intellectualizing, taking an idea and turning it into a garden, and taking a garden and turning it into an idea and playing with it. And I think the gardens that we've seen here in France show that they can do what the British, quite frankly, feel embarrassed about. We're clumsy intellectually compared to them.
I think this garden is beautiful as a garden, as well as crossing the line to becoming a fascinating work of art. But did Patrick and Sylvie make it with that in mind?
Nous, ça s'appelle le jardin de plumes parce qu'on veut essayer d'atteindre ça, modestement.
Il y a du travail.
C'est-à-dire qu'on veut que le jardin soit en harmonie avec, je ne sais pas moi, le vol des papillons, qui est cette espèce de légèreté, ce plaisir que tout ça soit, je ne sais pas, en harmonie.
Le jardin est beau, ça c'est clair. Mais est-ce que vous avez d'abord fait un objet de l'art? Est-ce que c'est un jardin comme l'art?
Grande question. C'est compliqué. Parce que l'art, souvent, c'est des choses qui sont créées et qui sont... Un tableau, par exemple, c'est fini. Un jardin, c'est peut-être de l'art, je ne sais pas. Mais ça bouge, ça va bouger. Puis si les créateurs s'en vont ou sont morts, il n'y a plus de jardin. Donc c'est très particulier. Donc, est-ce que c'est de l'art ou pas? Peut-être certaines parties peuvent faire penser à de l'art, oui, parce que tout ce qui est dessiné, structuré...
Et c'est comme une sculpture, c'est...
Oui, mais la chose, c'est que c'est éphémère. C'est quand même un art peut-être un peu éphémère, le jardin.
The ephemeral nature of gardening certainly does make it an elusive medium for art. But I think that this garden achieves it through the combination of its deceptively simple and pared-down layout and the way that the planting is encouraged to be so transitory and loose. There is one final stop to make on this journey, and it is the garden most strongly associated with art in the world, let alone France. It's late summer, and I have returned to Claude Monet's garden at Giverny, also in Normandy. This time, I'm going to see the water lilies in flower in his famous water garden.
When I came here in spring, obviously the water lilies weren't out at all. And it feels wrong to be in France and not come back and not see them. And there they are.
By 1892, 10 years after he moved here, Monet had made enough money from the sale of his paintings to purchase more land to make a large water garden, loosely inspired by the Japanese prints that he collected. For the next 30 years, he was to paint it obsessively, even as the guns of the Western Front began to rumble within earshot of Giverny.
It's funny, because I know what water lilies look like, but I confess that my initial reaction is one of being underwhelmed. It's somehow less than I expected. But actually that's unfair. It's unfair on the plants, it's unfair on Monet and the paintings, because it's to get it wrong. The water lilies themselves are not important. What Monet was painting was the light. That's what obsessed him. And light on water, which bounces and is reflected and comes off at angles and shimmers and sinks slightly beneath the water, is endlessly fascinating.
There's no doubt that the pond with its elusive light entranced Monet, as well as providing an escape from the loss of his wife and the horror of the First World War. Monet gave these 8 huge panels to the nation in 1918 as a celebration of the end of the war. But he couldn't part with them or even stop working on them, and they weren't installed here until after his death in 1926. The paintings increase our artistic appreciation of the garden, and visiting the garden enables us to appreciate and understand the paintings all the more. And Giverny seems to have given Monet an endless canvas, which he could both plant and provide inspiration for his paintings.
I think that where gardening is special, as opposed to all kinds of other ways of looking at the world, is the relationship of the gardener with the land is intimate. It's something that is very deep. And if it taps something inside you, then it can produce great art.
And what makes French artistic gardens so particular is the ease with which they combine intellectual, abstract concepts with an earthy love of plants. In this series, I've learnt so much about France and its gardens. From how the historic grandeur of Versailles was created, wow, to the way that the medieval monastic tradition makes a modern kitchen garden.
I hope you like the vegetables.
I love vegetables.
From the evolving charm of Corrence to the Michelin-starred restaurant producing all its own organic produce.
got body. This is a muscular tomato.
And of course, the influential formal potager at Villandry. And I've seen gardens that set the standard for gardens of their type right across the world. And as I've travelled around France, I've learned that they still respect order, formality, and doing things in the correct manner. But they also take delight in abstract ideas and intellectual concepts. And the French have a deeply romantic streak, running from Josephine's Malmaison to the crazy but wonderful modern extravaganza of Champ de Bataille.
Amazing.
And above all, their love of style and flair in their gardens, as in every aspect of life.
When I came to France as a teenager, I was pretty sure what I wanted. I wanted light, I wanted art, I wanted the sort of creative impulse that seemed to come from the south. And obviously now I've got older, a lot of those things have gone. Some of them have matured and changed, life's got complicated. But the more I visit gardens and travel, it's clear that two things happen. One, you start to piece your past together by this new and changing present. As you get older, things make sense, and through seeing gardens, it's the medium which I can measure out my world. And also, the more that you learn about a culture and a civilization and a people through the way that they make gardens, the more that you learn about yourself.
Friday night banter with the boys. Next tonight on BBC HD, Alan Davis, Cal Wilson, Rob Brydon and Phil Jupitus join Stephen Fry for QI.